Chapter 1. The Unexpected Witness. Cedric had always thought himself reasonably prepared for most things life might throw at him. 7 years at Hogwarts had taught him to expect the unexpected, moving staircases, portraits that argued back, professors who occasionally turned into cats. The Triwizard Tournament had stretched that adaptability further still, demanding he face dragons and merpeople and navigate a maze that seemed determined to disorient him at every turn. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the sickening lurch of a portkey activating when he'd expected only the solid weight of a trophy in his hands. Harry! The name tore from his throat as the world spun away in a kaleidoscope of colours and nausea. Beside him, Harry Potter's face was white with shock, his mouth forming words that were lost in the howling wind of magical transport. They'd grabbed the cup together, hadn't they? A moment of shared victory, 2 champions from the same school, choosing cooperation over competition. The landing was brutal. Cedric hit the ground hard, his knees striking cold stone, the Triwizard Cup skittering away across what looked like grass? No, not grass. Weeds. Wild, untamed growth around crumbling headstones that jutted from the earth like broken teeth. A graveyard. Where are we? Harry's voice cracked with the question, and Cedric felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The younger boy was struggling to his feet, his famous lightning bolt scar stark against his pale forehead in the dim light. But I don't know. Cedric's prefect training kicked in automatically. Assess the situation, keep the younger student calm, find a way out. But even as he said it, his eyes were cataloguing details that made his stomach clench with dread. Ancient headstones, a looming church in the distance, and there, barely visible in the gathering dusk, a figure approaching them. No, not approaching, shuffling, dragging something behind him. "Get behind me," Cedric whispered, his hand moving instinctively toward his wand, but Harry was already backing away, his own wand appearing in his grip with the fluid motion of someone who'd had to draw it in haste far too many times for a 14-year-old boy. The figure resolved into a man, short, balding, with silver hair that gleamed in the moonlight. He was dragging a bundle wrapped in dark robes, or something that writhed and made soft, horrible sounds that barely qualified as human. Wormtail. The voice that emerged from the bundle was high and cold and utterly without mercy. "Put me by the cauldron." Cedric felt the world tilt sideways. That voice, that impossible, terrible voice that belonged in nightmares and whispered stories, not in the real world where 17-year-old boys won Quidditch matches and worried about their NEWTS. The man, Wormtail, moved to obey, placing his burden beside a large stone cauldron that Cedric hadn't noticed before. When he straightened, his face was visible in the moonlight, and Cedric's breath caught in his throat. This was the same face that had stared out from Daily Prophet wanted posters for months. Peter Pettigrew, the man who'd betrayed Harry's parents. "Harry," Cedric breathed. Yes, but Harry's attention was fixed on the bundle by the cauldron with the intensity of someone watching a snake that might strike at any moment. The bundle stirred, and something that might once have been a baby's cry issued from within the dark robes. "Hurry, Wormtail, I can feel him fighting the Imperious Curse." Him? Cedric's mind raced. Who else was here? And what Imperious Curse? Wormtail raised his wand with a trembling hand. "Imperio!" The compulsion hit Cedric like a physical blow, washing over his mind with silken promises of obedience. How easy it would be to simply stand still, to watch quietly, to offer no resistance to whatever was about to unfold. The curse was powerful, expertly cast, and for a moment, Cedric felt his will dissolving like sugar in rain. But 17 years of his father's patient lessons in magical defense, combined with the natural Hufflepuff stubbornness that had carried him through the tournament's challenges, proved stronger than Wormtail's desperation. Cedric shook his head violently, feeling the curse crack and splinter around the edges of his consciousness. Beside him, Harry was swaying slightly, his eyes unfocused. The curse had taken hold of the younger boy completely. "Bone of the father, unknowingly given," Wormtail was chanting now, and Cedric watched in growing horror as dust rose from the nearest headstone. Tom Riddle, the name read, and fell into the cauldron with a sound like whispered secrets. The liquid within began to bubble and hiss, giving off a sickly green light that made Cedric's skin crawl. This was dark magic. Real dark magic. The kind that left stains on souls and summoned things that should never see daylight. "Flesh of the servant, willingly given." Wormtail's voice broke on the words, but his silver hand moved without hesitation to sever his own flesh. The scream that followed seemed to echo off every headstone in the graveyard, and Cedric had to bite down hard on his own tongue to keep from crying out in sympathetic agony. Blood. So much blood, pooling on the ground and dripping into the cauldron with obscene little splashes. Blood of the enemy, forcibly taken. No, not Harry. Cedric's body moved before his mind fully processed the decision, launching himself forward as Wormtail advanced on Harry with a silver dagger raised high. They collided in a tangle of limbs, and Wormtail's aim went wide. The blade meant for Harry's arm instead, opening a gash across Cedric's shoulder that burned like liquid fire. Avada Kedavra! The green light of the killing curse seared across Cedric's vision as he tackled Harry to the ground, both boys rolling desperately behind the shelter of a large headstone. The curse struck the marble where Cedric's head had been a heartbeat before, leaving a crater that smoked in the night air. "You little—" Wormtail's snarl was cut off by a sound that made every hair on Cedric's body stand on end. Laughter. High, cold laughter that belonged to nightmares and madness. "Enough, Wormtail. His blood will serve just as well." The voice from the cauldron had changed, grown stronger somehow. "And now we have two witnesses to our moment of triumph." Cedric pressed himself against the cold marble of their shelter, his bleeding shoulder screaming in protest. Beside him, Harry was blinking rapidly, or the imperious curse finally beginning to fade from his eyes. "Cedric!" Harry's voice was small and lost. "What's happening?" Before Cedric could answer, the night exploded into silver light and steam as whatever had been brewing in the cauldron reached its crescendo. When the vapor cleared, a figure stood where the bundle had been, tall, skeletal, with red eyes that gleamed like malevolent stars in a face whiter than bone. Lord Voldemort had returned, and he was laughing. "Look at them, Wormtail. Two little birds cowering behind their stone. One who lived to trouble me before, and one who was not supposed to see this night." The Dark Lord's voice carried easily across the graveyard, conversational in tone, despite the malice that dripped from every word. How fitting that Dumbledore's pet should witness the success of his own master's plan. Cedric's blood turned to ice in his veins. His own master's plan? Voldemort's terrible gaze found them through the marble, as if stone meant nothing to him. "Oh yes, young Diggory. Did you think this was mere chance? That the great Albus Dumbledore, master manipulator of minds and hearts, had no knowledge of what this tournament truly was?" The laugh that followed was like breaking glass. "The old fool orchestrated your presence here as surely as if he had placed the portkey himself. He knew, oh how he knew, that I would use the boy's blood in my resurrection. And he knew that in doing so, I would grant him the very protection he sought to preserve." Harry made a strangled sound beside him, but Cedric barely heard it over the roar of understanding in his own ears. "You see," Voldemort continued, beginning to pace among the headstones like a professor delivering a lecture, "Lily Potter's protection lives in her son's blood. By taking that blood into myself, I have ensured that while I live, Harry Potter cannot die by my hand. Dumbledore understood this. He counted on my arrogance, my desire to use the very thing that once defeated me in my own resurrection." The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. The tournament. The selection of 4 champions instead of 3. Harry's name emerging from the goblet, despite his age, despite the powerful enchantments meant to prevent such things. "He knew," Cedric whispered, and the words felt like shards of glass in his throat. "Thought he knew this would happen." Indeed he did. Voldemort's smile was the stuff of nightmares. "And now you know as well. 2 witnesses to the night Lord Voldemort returned to power, and to the knowledge that Albus Dumbledore sacrificed you, both on the altar of his greater good." The portkey, the cup, still lay where it had fallen, gleaming silver in the moonlight, 20 feet away. Maybe 25. If they could reach it. "Harry," Cedric breathed, so quietly he hoped only the other boy could hear. "On my mark, run for the cup." But Voldemort was still speaking, still pacing, still gloating over his triumph and Dumbledore's perceived victory. The old man always was too clever for his own good. He saw 13 years into the future, planned for contingencies I had not even imagined. "And you, my dear boy," his red eyes fixed on Harry, "thus you were always meant to be here tonight. The lamb led to slaughter by the very shepherd who claimed to protect the flock." Rage, pure, burning rage, flooded through Cedric's chest. Not at Voldemort, who was a monster and could be nothing else, but at the gentle, grandfatherly figure who handed out lemon drops in his office and spoke of the power of choice, who had apparently chosen for them all. "Now," he hissed. They moved together, sprinting across the uneven ground toward the gleaming cup. Behind them, Voldemort's laughter followed like a curse, but he made no move to stop them. Why would he? He had revealed his triumph. He had witnesses to carry word of his return, and somewhere in his twisted logic, perhaps he even wanted them to live with this knowledge. Though Cedric's fingers closed around the cup's handle at the same moment as Harry's, the familiar lurch of portkey transport seized them both, and the graveyard spun away into darkness. They landed hard on the grass of the Hogwarts grounds, the lights of the castle blazing welcomingly in the distance. Around them, the sounds of celebration still echoed from the maze. The tournament had ended, and no one yet knew how badly things had gone wrong. Harry was shaking, great tremors that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his bones. But Cedric couldn't comfort him, couldn't offer reassurance or false hope or any of the things a prefect was supposed to say in a crisis. Because Dumbledore had known, had planned for this, had sent them both into that nightmare with full knowledge of what they would face. And somehow, impossibly, that felt like a betrayal, worse than anything Voldemort could have done. The sound of approaching footsteps, adults running toward them across the grass, should have been a relief. Instead, Cedric found himself wondering which of them had been complicit in the old man's plans, and which were as ignorant as he had been mere minutes ago. The boy who had entered that maze tonight was gone forever. In his place sat someone who had seen too much, learned too much, and would never again be able to look at Albus Dumbledore without remembering the sound of Voldemort's laughter in a moonlit graveyard. The witness Dumbledore had never intended to create was born. Chapter 2. The Burden of Truth. The celebration died the moment they appeared, for Cedric could hear it happening in waves. First, the triumphant cheers faltering as people noticed 2 figures sprawled on the grass instead of one victorious champion. Then the confused murmur as someone recognized Harry Potter's unmistakable lightning bolt scar, and finally the horrible, spreading silence as the crowd began to understand that something had gone catastrophically wrong. He wanted to stand, to project the confident competence that had carried him through 7 years at Hogwarts and 3 impossible tournament tasks. Instead, he remained sitting in the grass, his shoulder throbbing where Wormtail's blade had found its mark, watching the controlled chaos of adults who had expected a celebration and found a crisis instead. "Cedric! Harry!" Professor McGonagall reached them first, her tartan robes billowing behind her as she ran with a speed that belied her years. Behind her came the unmistakable figure of Albus Dumbledore, his long silver beard catching the light of the torches that had been meant to illuminate a victory ceremony. The sight of the headmaster should have brought relief. For 7 years Dumbledore had represented safety, wisdom, the ultimate authority who could make sense of any crisis. Now, with Voldemort's words still echoing in his ears, Cedric felt something cold and bitter twist in his stomach at the old man's approach. "My dear boys." Dumbledore's voice carried its familiar warmth, but Cedric found himself studying the blue eyes behind the half-moon spectacles, searching for some sign of... what? Guilt? Foreknowledge? Satisfaction that his plan had worked exactly as intended? "Professor." Harry's voice cracked on the word, and Cedric saw that the younger boy was shaking again, those terrible tremors that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than muscle and bone. "Professor, he's back. Voldemort. He's back." The crowd pressed closer at Harry's words, a sea of faces reflecting everything from disbelief to dawning horror. Cedric spotted his father's familiar form pushing through the press of bodies, Amos Diggory's face cycling through relief, confusion, and something approaching panic as he took in the blood on his son's robes. "Cedric!" His father dropped to his knees beside him, hands hovering uncertainly over Cedric's injured shoulder. "My boy, what happened? The cup was supposed to bring you back to the maze entrance, not..." "The cup was a port key." Cedric's voice sounded strange in his own ears, flat and distant. "It took us to a graveyard. Little Hangleton." He saw Dumbledore's eyes sharpen with what might have been genuine surprise, or might have been an excellent performance. Voldemort was there, waiting. "Impossible," someone in the crowd whispered, but Dumbledore raised his hand for silence. "We must get them to the hospital wing immediately." The headmaster's tone brooked no argument. "Poppy will want to examine them both. Afterward, when they've been treated, we can..." He knew. The words left Cedric's mouth before he could stop them, cutting through Dumbledore's measured response like a blade through silk. "Voldemort said you knew. About the tournament. About what it really was." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the night sounds of the castle grounds seemed muted. And as if the very air was holding its breath, Harry turned to stare at him, green eyes wide with something that might have been betrayal. "Cedric, you're in shock. You misheard, or..." "I didn't mishear anything." Cedric met Harry's gaze steadily, then looked up at Dumbledore. The old man's face was carefully neutral, giving away nothing. "He said you orchestrated Harry's presence there, that you knew he would use Harry's blood in his resurrection, and that by doing so, he would actually strengthen the protection Lily Potter died to create." Amos Diggory's intake of breath was audible. Around them, the crowd began to murmur again, but this time the sound carried a different quality: uncertainty, suspicion, the beginning of something that might grow into doubt. "Cedric." Dumbledore's voice remained calm, but there was something in his tone that hadn't been there before. A careful precision that reminded Cedric, uncomfortably, of the way the headmaster spoke during disciplinary hearings. "You have been through a terrible ordeal. Your mind is attempting to make sense of events that would challenge anyone's understanding. Perhaps we should..." "My mind is fine." Cedric climbed to his feet, ignoring the way the movement sent fresh fire through his wounded shoulder. "And my hearing is excellent. He said you counted on his arrogance, his desire to use the very thing that once defeated him. He called you too clever for your own good." Harry was shaking his head, backing away, as if distance could somehow make Cedric's words less real. No, that's not..." Professor Dumbledore didn't know. He couldn't have known. He tried to stop me from competing. Remember? He argued with the ministry officials about the age restriction. Did he? The question came out sharper than Cedric had intended. Or did he put on a show of arguing, while knowing perfectly well that the goblet had already been tampered with, that Barty Crouch Jr. was sitting right there at the head table, wearing Mad-Eye Moody's face and waiting for his moment to ensure you reached that cup? The sound Amos Diggory made was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. "Cedric, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that my son nearly died tonight because someone—" Cedric looked directly at Dumbledore, watching for any flicker of admission in those blue eyes. Decided that getting Harry to that graveyard was worth the risk of a 17-year-old boy's life. "That's enough." McGonagall's voice cut through the tension like a whip crack. "Mr. Diggory, you are clearly suffering from shock and trauma. These accusations are they?" Cedric turned to face his head of house, the woman who had taught him transfiguration and trusted him with prefect responsibilities and praised his dedication to his studies. "Professor, in my 4 years as a prefect, how many times have you seen students placed in mortal danger due to Hogwarts' security failures?" McGonagall's lips tightened. "The school has faced unusual challenges in recent years. Harry's first year, he faced Voldemort directly in the chambers beneath the school. His second year, the Chamber of Secrets was opened and students were petrified. His third year, Dementors were stationed on the grounds, and Sirius Black penetrated the castle's defenses." Cedric's voice remained level, but he could feel his father's horrified stare like a weight against his back. "And now, in Harry's 4th year, he's been entered into a deadly tournament, despite magical protections that should have prevented it, ultimately leading to his transport to a location where Voldemort was waiting. The crowd was stirring now, whispers spreading like ripples in a pond. Cedric caught sight of other parents, the Weasleys, their faces pale with dawning realization, and Hermione's parents, who had come to watch the final task and were now witnessing something far different than they'd expected. 4 years, Cedric continued, but his eyes never leaving Dumbledore's face. 4 years of coincidences and security failures and situations that somehow always result in Harry Potter being placed directly in Voldemort's path. What are the odds, Professor? Statistically speaking. You don't understand the complexities involved, Dumbledore said quietly. There are forces at work here that require what? Amos Diggory found his voice, and it shook with anger. Require using children as bait? My son could have been killed tonight because of your forces at work. Harry was staring between Cedric and Dumbledore, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. But he saved me, he said finally, the words barely audible. Professor Dumbledore has saved me so many times. Or he couldn't. Saved you from situations you should never have been in to begin with, Cedric said gently. He could see the pain in Harry's eyes, the desperate need to believe in the man who had been his protector and guide. Harry, think about it. Really think. How many times has Dumbledore arrived at exactly the right moment to pull you from danger? And how many times was that danger something that could have been prevented entirely if proper precautions had been taken? Stop. Harry's voice cracked like breaking glass. Just stop. You're wrong. You have to be wrong. But even as he said it, Cedric could see the doubt creeping into the younger boy's expression, the terrible, growing awareness that some questions, once asked, demanded answers. Or so I think, Dumbledore said, with the careful tone of someone choosing words like weapons, that this conversation would be better continued in private, after medical attention has been provided and emotions have had time to settle. No. The word came out harder than Cedric had intended, but he didn't regret it. No more private conversations, no more careful management of information. If Harry and I were meant to be witnesses to Voldemort's return, then we'll be witnesses to all of it. He turned to address the crowd directly, ignoring the sharp intake of breath from several of the professors. Tonight, Lord Voldemort returned to physical form, using a ritual that required Harry Potter's blood. He gloated about this to his followers, explaining that Albus Dumbledore had counted on this exact scenario, that by using Harry's blood, or Voldemort would actually strengthen the magical protection that keeps Harry alive. The whispers in the crowd were growing louder now, taking on an ugly edge that made Cedric's stomach clench with something that might have been regret. But the truth was the truth, wasn't it? Even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. Cedric. His father's voice was soft, pleading. Son, please. Think about what you're saying. Think about what you're doing. Cedric met his father's eyes and saw fear there, not for Cedric's safety, but for his future, for what it might cost him to stand up against the most powerful wizard in Britain and accuse him of using children as pawns in some vast, incomprehensible game. I'm thinking, Dad. Maybe for the first time in my life. He looked around at the sea of faces, students, parents, professors, the ministry officials who had come to witness a tournament and found themselves in the middle of something that would change everything. I'm thinking that if we don't ask these questions now, who will? And when? Somewhere in the crowd, someone began to clap, slowly, deliberately, the sound carrying clearly in the night air. Others joined in, and Cedric realized with a mixture of pride and terror that some people, at least, were ready to hear the questions he was asking. But Harry was backing away, shaking his head, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I can't, he whispered. I can't believe that. Not about him. And Cedric understood, with a clarity that hurt, that their friendship, forged in the maze, tested in the graveyard, might not survive the truth he was determined to tell, or the burden of being the witness Dumbledore had never intended to create was heavier than any trophy he had ever lifted. Chapter 3. Seeds of Doubt. 3 days had passed since the graveyard, and Cedric found that sleep had become an elusive stranger. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard Voldemort's cold laughter echoing off ancient headstones, saw the terrible satisfaction in those red eyes as the Dark Lord explained how perfectly his resurrection had proceeded according to someone else's design. The official story was already taking shape, crafted with the careful precision that Cedric was beginning to recognize as Dumbledore's particular specialty. Yes, Voldemort had returned. There was no denying that with 2 witnesses. Yes, the Triwizard Cup had been tampered with by persons unknown, though suspicion naturally fell on Death Eaters who had infiltrated the tournament somehow. And yes, both champions had shown remarkable courage in the face of an unprecedented crisis. What the official story did not mention were Voldemort's specific words about Dumbledore's foreknowledge. That particular detail seemed to have been quietly omitted from all reports, dismissed as the confused recollections of a traumatized teenager. Cedric was not confused, and he was done being dismissed. You're researching what, exactly? Cho Chang's voice carried a note of careful concern as she slid into the seat across from him in the far corner of the Hogwarts library. It was late afternoon, the golden light streaming through the tall windows, doing nothing to warm the chill that had settled in Cedric's bones since that night. Harry Potter's academic career, Cedric replied, not looking up from the stack of old Daily Prophet issues he'd borrowed from the library's archive section. It makes for fascinating reading once you start looking for patterns. Cho leaned forward, her dark hair falling like a curtain as she peered at the newspapers spread across the table. Cedric, what are you doing? He finally met her eyes, seeing his own exhaustion reflected there. Cho had been staying close since the tournament ended, offering quiet support without asking too many questions. But now, with the evidence mounting in front of him, he needed someone else to see what he was seeing. Look at this. He pulled out a prophet from June 1992, the headline screaming about the Chamber of Secrets crisis. Harry's second year, and the school was placed under lockdown because an unknown monster was petrifying students. The faculty claimed they had no idea what was happening or how to stop it. I remember, Cho said softly. I was terrified that whole year. We all were. Right. Terrified because the adults who were supposed to protect us claimed ignorance about a threat that turned out to be a 1,000-year-old basilisk living in the school's plumbing. Cedric's finger traced the article's text. But here's the interesting part. The crisis only ended when 12-year-old Harry Potter somehow located the chamber, defeated a 60-foot serpent, and destroyed what we now know was one of Voldemort's Horcruxes. Cho frowned. That's what heroes do, isn't it? Rise to meet impossible challenges? Once, maybe. Or twice could be coincidence. Cedric pulled out another paper, this one from June 1991. But Harry's first year, the Philosopher's Stone crisis. Again, the faculty claimed surprise when Professor Quirrell turned out to be possessed by Voldemort. Again, the threat was only neutralized when 11-year-old Harry Potter somehow made his way through a series of magical protections that should have been impenetrable to a student. He watched Cho's expression change as she began to understand what he was showing her. And then last year, the Sirius Black situation. Dementors stationed on the school grounds. A dangerous fugitive supposedly targeting Harry specifically. How did that crisis resolve? Harry Potter, once again placed in direct danger, but once again emerging victorious through what everyone insists was luck and courage. You're saying... Cho's voice was barely a whisper. You're saying Professor Dumbledore knew about all of it. I'm saying that if you wanted to train a 13-year-old boy to face the most dangerous dark wizard in history, you might arrange for him to have practice. Progressively more difficult challenges, each one designed to teach specific skills while maintaining plausible deniability about your involvement. Cho stared at the newspapers, her face pale in the afternoon light. But he's just a child, Cedric. Harry's just a boy. Exactly. The word came out harder than Cedric had intended, carrying all the anger and betrayal he'd been nursing for 3 days. That he's a child who's been systematically exposed to mortal peril every single year he's been at this school, while the most powerful wizard in Britain has watched from the sidelines and occasionally intervened at precisely the right moment to ensure survival. A shadow fell across their table, and Cedric looked up to see Professor Sprout approaching, her usually cheerful expression creased with concern. "Mr. Diggory," she said warmly. "Miss Chang. I hope you're both recovering well from the events of the tournament." "Professor." Cedric gathered the newspapers into a neat stack, but made no move to hide them. "Actually, I was hoping I might ask you something." Sprout settled into a chair beside them, her earth-stained hands folding in her lap. As head of Hufflepuff House, while she had always been more approachable than some of the other professors, more willing to treat her students as individuals rather than simply names on a roster. "Of course, dear. What's troubling you?" "During Harry Potter's second year," Cedric began carefully, "when the Chamber of Secrets was opened, did the faculty really have no idea what was happening?" Sprout's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "It was a very difficult time for all of us. The safety of our students is always our primary concern." "That's not what I asked." Cedric's prefect training had taught him to notice when adults evaded questions, and Professor Sprout was definitely evading. "I asked if you knew what was happening, if any of the staff knew." A long moment passed, filled only by the distant sound of students working at other tables. Finally, Sprout sighed. "There were theories," she admitted. "Professor Dumbledore had his suspicions about the nature of the threat, but without proof, without certainty." "He let it continue," Cho said, her voice sharp with realization. "He had suspicions about a basilisk loose in the school, and he let students walk the corridors, let them get petrified. It wasn't that simple, wasn't it?" Cedric leaned forward, his voice still respectful, but carrying an edge that made Sprout's eyes widen. "Professor, with respect, if you suspected the threat was a basilisk, there were precautions that could have been taken. Mirrors could have been distributed. Students could have been warned about the specific danger. Instead, the crisis was allowed to escalate until Harry Potter was forced to enter the chamber himself." Sprout was silent for a long moment, her weathered hands twisting in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Professor Dumbledore believed that Harry needed to face these challenges, that they were preparing him for something larger. She looked up, meeting Cedric's eyes with obvious reluctance. He said that shielding the boy too much would only make him vulnerable when the real test came. The real test. Cedric felt something cold settle in his stomach as the pieces clicked into place. How long has he known? The question came out as barely a whisper. How long has Dumbledore known that Voldemort would target Harry specifically? Since the prophecy, Sprout said, and then immediately looked as though she wished she could take the words back. What prophecy? But Professor Sprout was already standing, her face flushed with the realization of what she'd revealed. I've said too much. Mr. Diggory, I understand your concerns, but there are forces at work here that you don't fully comprehend. Professor Dumbledore has always acted in Harry Potter's best interests. Has he? Cedric stood as well, the newspapers scattering as he moved. Professor, if there's a prophecy that somehow predicts Voldemort targeting Harry, then every danger he's faced, every crisis he's been forced to navigate, all of it has been orchestrated. Training disguised as coincidence. Sprout's silence was answer enough. After she left, Cedric and Cho sat in the gathering dusk, the weight of revelation settling between them like a physical presence. There's more, isn't there? Cho asked finally. More we don't know yet. Cedric nodded, his eyes fixed on the scattered newspapers. A prophecy. Something important enough that Dumbledore has been shaping Harry's entire education around it. Something that required 4 years of progressively more dangerous coincidences to prepare a child for whatever's coming. What do we do now? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Cedric thought about Harry, probably in Gryffindor Tower at this very moment, still refusing to believe that his beloved headmaster might have been manipulating his life since he was 11 years old. He thought about his father, torn between pride in his son's courage and terror at the path Cedric seemed determined to walk. We find out what that prophecy says, Cedric said finally. We find out exactly what Dumbledore knows, and when he's known it. And then he paused, the weight of what he was contemplating settling on his shoulders like a cloak. Then we decide whether the wizarding world deserves to know the truth about its greatest hero. Cho reached across the table, her fingers closing over his. That's a dangerous path, Cedric. There will be people who don't want to hear what you're saying. Powerful people. I know. He squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her presence. But what's the alternative? Let Dumbledore continue using Harry as an unwitting weapon? And let other children be placed in danger because it serves some greater purpose that only he fully understands? You could be wrong, she said softly, about all of this. You could be seeing patterns where there are only coincidences. Cedric considered this, turning it over in his mind like a puzzle piece that might or might not fit. Then he shook his head. Voldemort was too specific, too satisfied with how perfectly his plan had worked. He wasn't gloating about outsmarting Dumbledore. He was gloating about Dumbledore outsmarting him, about the old man's willingness to sacrifice pawns for strategic advantage. He met Cho's eyes. I wasn't supposed to hear that, Cho. I wasn't supposed to survive to carry that knowledge back to Hogwarts. But I did. And now I have to decide what to do with it. They sat in silence as the library gradually emptied around them, other students drifting away to dinner or evening activities. When they were finally alone, Cho spoke again. If you're determined to pursue this, you'll need evidence. Real evidence, not just newspaper articles and overheard conversations. I know. But where do I even start looking for something like that? Cho was quiet for a moment, then smiled. The first genuine smile Cedric had seen from her since the tournament ended. Restricted section, she said simply. If there are records of this prophecy, if there's documentation of Dumbledore's long-term planning, that's where it would be. And you're forgetting something, Cedric Diggory. You're dating a Ravenclaw. We're very good at finding things that people try to hide. Despite everything, Cedric found himself smiling back. "Are you sure about this? Once we start down this path, there's no telling where it leads." "I'm sure." Cho's voice was steady, certain. "Because if you're right, if Harry's been manipulated and endangered for years while everyone praised Dumbledore's wisdom, then someone needs to speak for him. Someone needs to ask the questions he's too loyal to ask himself." Cedric nodded, feeling something that had been twisted in his chest since the graveyard finally began to loosen. He wasn't alone in this. Whatever came next, whatever truth they uncovered, or consequences they faced, he wouldn't be carrying the burden by himself. The seeds of doubt that had been planted in a moonlit graveyard were beginning to sprout, and Cedric intended to see what kind of garden they would grow. Chapter 4. The Hufflepuff's Resolve. The letter from his father had arrived with the morning post, its familiar handwriting immediately recognizable among the stack of well-wishes and interview requests that had been flooding Cedric's dormitory since news of his survival had spread. Unlike the others, which he'd been ignoring with increasing determination, this one demanded immediate attention. "Son, we need to talk. I'll be waiting in the 3 Broomsticks at 2 o'clock. Don't bring anyone else." Dad Cedric folded the letter carefully, his mind already racing through the conversation that awaited him. A week had passed since his discussion with Professor Sprout, a week of careful research and growing certainty that had only strengthened his resolve. But he knew his father well enough to recognize the tone behind those sparse words. Amos Diggory had heard about his son's questions, and he was not pleased. The walk to Hogsmeade felt longer than usual, each step carrying him closer to a confrontation he'd been dreading since the moment he'd first spoken Voldemort's revelations aloud. His father had always been his greatest supporter, the man who'd bragged shamelessly about Cedric's achievements to anyone who would listen. The thought of disappointing him, of fracturing their relationship over this terrible truth, sat in Cedric's stomach like a stone. He found Amos at a corner table, 2 butterbeer bottles sitting untouched between them. His father's face was carefully neutral, but Cedric could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed against the scarred wooden surface. "Dad." Cedric slid into the seat across from him, noting how his father's eyes immediately went to the healing scar on his shoulder, still visible despite Madame Pomfrey's excellent care. "Cedric." Amos's voice was quiet, controlled. "I've been hearing interesting things about your activities since the tournament ended. Questions you've been asking, conversations you've been having with professors." "I suppose you have." Cedric reached for one of the butterbeer bottles, buying himself a moment to gather his thoughts. "And I suppose you've heard what I've been saying about Professor Dumbledore. I've heard rumors, speculation, or things that sound like the kind of conspiracy theories that desperate people tell themselves when they need someone to blame for their pain." Amos leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Son, I know you've been through hell. What happened in that graveyard? No one should have to witness something like that. But this path you're walking, these accusations you're making, are based on evidence," Cedric interrupted gently. "Dad, I know how this sounds. I know how it looks. But I need you to listen to me. Really listen." For the next hour, Cedric laid out everything he'd discovered. The pattern of Harry's encounters with Voldemort, each one progressively more dangerous, and each one resolved only through the intervention of a child who should have been protected rather than tested. Professor Sprout's inadvertent confirmation of Dumbledore's long-term planning, the existence of a prophecy that had apparently shaped Harry's entire education. Amos listened in silence, his expression cycling through disbelief, horror, and finally, a kind of sick understanding that made Cedric's heart ache. "You're talking about the most respected wizard in Britain," Amos said finally, his voice hollow. "A man who defeated Grindelwald, who's led the fight against you-know-who for decades. You're saying he's been... what? Using children as weapons?" "I'm saying he's been preparing Harry Potter for a specific destiny, by ensuring he faces increasingly dangerous trials, Cedric replied. And I'm saying that preparation nearly cost both our lives 3 weeks ago. Amos was quiet for a long moment, staring into his untouched butterbeer as if it might hold answers. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. What do you want to do about it? I want to testify. Formally. To the Wizengamot, if necessary. Cedric felt something in his chest loosen as he said the words aloud. I want to tell the wizarding world what I heard in that graveyard, what I've learned about Dumbledore's methods. People deserve to know. And you're willing to risk everything for that? Your future, your reputation, our families standing in the community? Amos's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Son, once you make an accusation like this public, there's no taking it back. Dumbledore has allies everywhere, in the Ministry, in the Wizengamot, in every corner of magical society. They'll destroy you to protect him. Then that's a risk I'll have to take. Cedric reached across the table, covering his father's weathered hand with his own. Dad, if I don't speak for Harry Potter, who will? He's too loyal to question the man he sees as his protector. The adults around him are either complicit or too intimidated to act. Someone has to be his voice. Amos stared at his son for a long moment, and Cedric saw something shift in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. The kind of look a parent gives when they realize their child has become someone they didn't expect. You're certain about this evidence? About what you heard? Absolutely certain. Another long silence. Then Amos nodded slowly, his decision crystallizing like ice in winter air. Then we'll need help. Real help. From someone with the authority and integrity to make sure your testimony is heard properly. He squeezed Cedric's hand. I know someone at the Ministry. Amelia Bones. She's head of the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, but she has connections throughout law enforcement. If anyone would take this seriously, it would be her. Relief flooded through Cedric's chest, so sudden and overwhelming that he had to blink back tears. You believe me? I believe you, Amos confirmed. And more than that, I'm proud of you. Terrified for you, but proud. It takes real courage to stand up to power like this. 2 days later, Cedric found himself in a secure conference room deep within the Ministry of Magic, facing a woman whose reputation for fairness and competence was matched only by her reputation for absolute integrity. Amelia Bones was perhaps 50, with greying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of his appearance as he entered. Mr. Diggory. Her handshake was firm, businesslike. Your father tells me you have some serious concerns about recent events involving Harry Potter and Albus Dumbledore. I do, Mum. Cedric settled into the chair across from her, his father taking the seat beside him. I witnessed something in that graveyard that I believe the public deserves to know about. For the better part of 2 hours, Cedric recounted his story once again, watching Madame Bones's expression grow increasingly grave as he detailed Voldemort's revelations about Dumbledore's foreknowledge. When he finished, she was silent for several long minutes, her fingers steepled as she processed what she'd heard. This is an extraordinary accusation, Mr. Diggory, she said finally. If true, it would represent a fundamental breach of trust between one of our most respected figures and the children in his care. It's true, Cedric said simply. Every word of it. I believe you believe that. The question is whether we can prove it. Bones leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I'll be honest with you. I've had my own concerns about some of Professor Dumbledore's methods over the years. The frequency with which dangerous situations arise at Hogwarts, the pattern of young Harry Potter being placed in harm's way, it's raised questions among those of us who pay attention. Cedric felt his pulse quicken. You've noticed it too. I've noticed patterns that trouble me. But patterns aren't proof, and Dumbledore's reputation provides him with considerable protection against speculation. She paused, studying his face. However, if you're willing to testify under oath, to subject yourself to veritaserum if necessary, that changes things significantly. Eyewitness testimony from a credible source about specific statements made by you-know-who, that would be enough to open a formal investigation. I'm willing, Cedric said without hesitation. Whatever it takes. Bones nodded slowly. Then I'll begin making inquiries. Quietly for now. We'll need to build a solid case before bringing this to the full Wizengamot. But Mr. Diggory, you should understand that once we begin this process, there will be no stopping it. Dumbledore will undoubtedly learn of the investigation, and he has resources at his disposal that we're only beginning to understand. I understand the risks, Cedric replied, but the alternative is letting him continue to use children as pawns in whatever game he's playing. I can't live with that. The meeting concluded with promises of follow-up contact and warnings about maintaining discretion while the preliminary investigation proceeded. As Cedric and his father made their way back through the ministry's gleaming atrium, Amos placed a protective arm around his son's shoulders. Are you certain about this path, Cedric? Last chance to change your mind. I'm certain. But that certainty was tested severely the next evening, when Harry Potter cornered him outside the Great Hall, green eyes blazing with anger and betrayal. Is it true? Harry's voice shook with emotion. Are you really planning to testify against Professor Dumbledore? Cedric glanced around, noting the curious stares from other students passing by. Harry, maybe we should discuss this somewhere more private. No. Harry stepped closer, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I want an answer. Are you going to stand up in front of the Wizengamot and accuse the man who's saved my life countless times of... What? Manipulating me? Using me? I'm going to tell the truth about what I heard in that graveyard, Cedric said quietly. Nothing more, nothing less. You heard wrong! The words exploded from Harry with the force of years of pent-up loyalty and desperate need to believe. You were traumatized, confused. They're probably still under the influence of some curse. I heard correctly. Cedric's voice remained steady, despite the pain of watching their friendship fracture in real time. And deep down, Harry, I think you know that. I think you've always known that something wasn't right about how many dangerous situations you find yourself in. Harry's face went white, then flushed red with anger. He's protected me. Every time something went wrong, he was there. He saved me from Quirrell. He helped me with the chamber. After letting you face those dangers alone first, Cedric pointed out gently. Harry, when have you ever been protected from danger at Hogwarts? When have the adults around you ever taken steps to keep you safe before the crisis reached its peak? For a moment, something flickered in Harry's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or recognition. But it was gone almost immediately, replaced by the stubborn loyalty that had defined his relationship with Dumbledore since his first day at Hogwarts. You don't understand, Harry said, his voice cracking. You don't know what he's done for me, what he's sacrificed. I understand more than you think, Cedric replied sadly. But I also understand that good intentions don't excuse putting children in mortal danger. And I understand that if I don't speak up now, if I let fear or friendship stop me from telling the truth, then I'm as complicit in whatever comes next as everyone else who's stayed silent. Harry stared at him for a long moment, his expression cycling through anger, hurt, and finally, a kind of cold disappointment that made Cedric's heart ache. I thought I could trust you, Harry said finally. I thought you were my friend. I am your friend, Cedric replied. That's why I'm doing this. But Harry was already walking away, his shoulders rigid with betrayal and hurt. Other students gave him a wide berth as he stalked toward Gryffindor Tower, leaving Cedric standing alone in the corridor with the weight of his choice settling around him like a mantle. That night, as he sat in his dormitory reviewing the notes he'd compiled over the past weeks, Cho found him staring out the window at the lake, its surface reflecting the stars like scattered diamonds. "Second thoughts?" she asked gently, settling beside him on his bed. "About a dozen of them every hour," Cedric admitted. "But not about the core decision. Harry hates me now. My father's risking his career by supporting me, and we're about to take on the most powerful wizard in Britain. Any sane person would walk away." "Good thing Hufflepuffs aren't known for being sane," Cho said with a small smile. "We're known for being loyal, hard-working, and fair. And what could be more fair than demanding answers about why children are being used as weapons?" Cedric turned to look at her. This brilliant, brave girl who had chosen to stand beside him despite all the risks. "Are you sure about this?" "Really sure. Once Bones begins her investigation, once this becomes public, there won't be any safe ground for any of us." Cho's answer was to take his hand, threading their fingers together with the same quiet determination that had marked every conversation they'd shared since the graveyard. "I'm sure," she said simply, "because someone has to speak for Harry Potter, and for every other student who's been placed in danger while the adults who should protect them look the other way. If that someone has to be us, then so be it." Cedric squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her certainty. Outside, the lake continued its gentle dance with the starlight, beautiful and serene and utterly deceptive in its tranquility. Like everything else at Hogwarts, it looked safe until you learned to see the dangers lurking beneath the surface. But he was done pretending those dangers didn't exist. He was done accepting that children should pay the price for adult decisions. Harry Potter might never forgive him. Dumbledore's supporters might try to destroy him, and the wizarding world might condemn him for challenging their greatest hero. But the truth was the truth, and Cedric Diggory, loyal, fair, the hard-working Hufflepuff that he was, had made his choice. He would speak, whatever the cost. Chapter 5. Preparing for War. The summons came at dawn, delivered by Fawkes in a flutter of scarlet and gold feathers that seemed almost mocking in the grey morning light. Cedric had been expecting it, of course. Word of his meeting with Amelia Bones had spread through the Ministry's carefully constructed networks of gossip and obligation, and it was inevitable that such news would eventually reach the office of the Hogwarts headmaster. The phoenix perched on his windowsill, tilting its magnificent head, as if studying him with ancient, knowing eyes. The message attached to its leg was brief, written in Dumbledore's familiar flowing script. "My dear Cedric, I believe it would be beneficial for us to speak privately about recent events. Would you be so kind as to join me in my office at your earliest convenience? Yours truly, a PWB Dumbledore." "Tell him I'll be there in an hour," Cedric said quietly, and Fawkes trilled once before disappearing in a burst of flame that left only the faint scent of cinnamon behind. Cedric dressed carefully, choosing his formal school robes and ensuring his prefect badge was properly positioned. Whatever Dumbledore intended to say, this would not be a casual conversation between headmaster and student. This would be a negotiation between adversaries, and Cedric intended to make it clear that he understood exactly what was at stake. The walk to Dumbledore's office felt longer than usual, each step echoing off the castle's stone walls like a countdown toward some inevitable confrontation. While students he passed in the corridors looked at him with mixtures of curiosity, admiration, and wariness. Word of his accusations had spread throughout Hogwarts, creating a palpable tension that seemed to permeate every interaction. "Chocolate frogs," Cedric said to the gargoyle guarding the headmaster's office, and the stone creature stepped aside with what might have been reluctance. He found Dumbledore standing before the tall windows that looked out over the Hogwarts grounds, his hands clasped behind his back and his long silver beard catching the morning light. The office was exactly as Cedric remembered from his few previous visits, crowded with magical instruments that hummed and clicked, portraits of former headmasters pretending to sleep, and shelves lined with ancient tomes whose titles seemed to shift when observed directly. "Wah, Cedric." Dumbledore turned, and his blue eyes, those famously twinkling eyes that had charmed generations of students, were grave behind his half-moon spectacles. "Thank you for coming so promptly. Please, sit." Cedric remained standing. "Professor." A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, or recognition, crossed Dumbledore's features. He had expected the usual deference, Cedric realized, the automatic respect that students showed their headmaster. Instead, he was faced with a young man who had chosen to stand as an equal. "I believe," Dumbledore began, settling into his chair with deliberate calm, "that we have reached a point where certain truths must be acknowledged. I understand you have concerns about my methods, but about decisions I have made regarding Harry Potter's safety and education." "Not concerns," Cedric replied evenly. "Certainties. I heard Voldemort's words, Professor. I know you orchestrated Harry's presence in that graveyard, knowing full well what would happen there." Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled as he studied Cedric's face. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to press against the very air of the room. "You are correct, of course. I did know. Not the specifics, not the exact method Voldemort would use to return to corporeal form. But yes, I knew that Harry would eventually be placed in a position where he would face the Dark Lord directly. It was inevitable." The casual admission hit Cedric like a physical blow, even though he had been expecting it. To hear it spoken aloud, or to have his worst suspicions confirmed so matter-of-factly, left him momentarily speechless. "How long?" he managed finally. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since the night his parents died." Dumbledore's voice was quiet, but it carried across the office like a funeral bell. "The prophecy that governs Harry's destiny was made before his birth, Cedric. It speaks of a boy born as the 7th month dies, born to those who have thrice defied the Dark Lord. It speaks of power he knows not, and of a choice. Neither can live while the other survives." Cedric felt the blood drain from his face. "You've known since he was a baby that he would have to face Voldemort. And instead of protecting him, instead of preparing him properly, you've spent 4 years putting him in increasingly dangerous situations. I have spent 4 years ensuring that when the time came, and it would come, regardless of my actions, Harry would have the strength, the knowledge, and the moral foundation necessary to make the right choice." Dumbledore leaned forward, his eyes intense with conviction. Every trial he has faced, every danger he has overcome, has prepared him for the ultimate confrontation that awaits. "By nearly getting him killed!" Cedric's composure finally cracked, his voice rising with anger and disbelief. "Professor, he was 11 years old when you let him face Quirrell. 11! He could have died a dozen times over these past 4 years, and your response has been to arrange for him to face even greater dangers." "Yes," Dumbledore said simply, "dead because the alternative, shielding him completely, keeping him safe and ignorant, would have ensured his death when Voldemort finally found him. As find him he would, prophecy or no prophecy." The headmaster rose from his chair, moving to stand before a portrait of a previous headmaster who was watching their exchange with obvious fascination. "You see sacrifice where I see preparation, Cedric. You see endangerment where I see necessary education. The greater good." "Don't!" The word cut through the air like a blade. "Don't you dare talk to me about the greater good. I nearly died in that graveyard, Professor. Harry nearly died. And you're sitting here telling me it was all part of your plan, as if our lives are just pieces on some vast chessboard that only you can see." Dumbledore turned back to face him, and for the first time since Cedric had entered the office, the old man looked his age, ancient, weary, carrying the weight of decades of impossible decisions. "Our lives are pieces on that board, Cedric. All of our lives. Mine included. The difference is that I have seen enough of the game to understand the stakes involved." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "If I had not prepared Harry as I did, if he had not faced Voldemort in the graveyard that night, the Dark Lord's return would have been different. More complete. More devastating. The blood protection that now shields Harry would not exist. And what about the dozen other ways you could have prepared him? Cedric demanded. What about proper training, proper protection, proper support? What about treating him like a person instead of a weapon? Because, Dumbledore said with infinite sadness, weapons do not make the same choices that people do. And it is the choices we make, Cedric, that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities. Harry needed to choose, again and again, to stand against darkness. He needed to learn that he could survive it, that he could triumph over it, not because he was protected from it, but because he chose to fight it. Cedric stared at the man who had been his headmaster for 7 years, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Not the benevolent grandfather figure of popular imagination, but a brilliant, ruthless strategist who viewed human lives as acceptable casualties in service of his vision of the greater good. "You're asking me to remain silent," he said finally. "That's what this conversation is really about. You want me to keep your secrets, to let the wizarding world continue believing that you're their savior rather than their puppet master." "I am asking you to consider the consequences of your testimony," Dumbledore replied. "Not just for me, but for Harry, for Hogwarts, for the fight against Voldemort that has only just begun. My methods may be questionable, but my goals remain unchanged: the defeat of darkness and the protection of the innocent." "And who protects the innocent from you?" Cedric asked quietly. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft ticking of magical instruments and the distant sound of students beginning their day. Finally, Dumbledore nodded. "I see that your mind is made up. I had hoped. But no matter. You must do what you believe is right. Oh, as must I." Cedric moved toward the door, then paused. "Professor, when you decided that Harry's life was an acceptable risk for your greater good, did you ever consider that you might be wrong? That your greater good might be nothing more than the justification of a man who's forgotten that other people aren't playing pieces in his game?" Dumbledore's answer followed him down the spiral staircase, quiet and sad, and utterly unrepentant. "Every day, my dear boy. Every day." The news of Cedric's formal testimony had spread through the wizarding world like wildfire, creating ripples of controversy that reached into every corner of magical society. Nowhere was this division more apparent than in the Weasley household, where the sound of raised voices had become as common as the ticking of the kitchen clock. "Arthur, how can you even consider supporting this?" Molly Weasley's voice carried through the burrow's thin walls as Cedric approached the front door, Amos beside him, and a small legal briefcase in his father's hands. "Professor Dumbledore saved our family more times than I can count. He saved all of us. And I'm grateful for that, Molly. Truly I am." Arthur's voice was strained, tired in the way that came from having the same argument repeatedly. "But gratitude doesn't mean blind faith. If there's truth to what the Diggory boy is saying, there's no if about it, Mr. Weasley." The interruption came from an unexpected source, Hermione Granger's voice, sharp with the certainty that came from thorough research. "I've spent the past week reviewing every crisis Harry has faced since coming to Hogwarts, and the pattern is undeniable. In each case, adult intervention came only after Harry had already been placed in mortal danger." Cedric exchanged a glance with his father before knocking on the door. The voices inside immediately fell silent, and a moment later Arthur Weasley opened the door, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes warm with welcome. "Cedric, Amos, come in, please. We were just discussing recent developments." The Burrow's kitchen was crowded with Weasleys and their allies, Arthur and Molly, Ron looking confused and uncomfortable, the twins watching everything with calculating interest, and Hermione sitting at the scrubbed wooden table with a stack of books and parchments spread before her like battle plans. "Hermione," Cedric said, genuinely surprised to see Harry's closest friend among his supporters, "I didn't expect to find you here." She looked up from her research, her bushy hair more unruly than usual, and her eyes bright with the fervor of intellectual discovery. I had to know, Cedric. I had to understand whether what you're saying is true, or if it's just grief and trauma making you see patterns that aren't there. And what did you find? Evidence, she said simply. Lots of it. The Philosopher's Stone crisis could have been prevented entirely if Dumbledore had simply removed the stone from Hogwarts the moment he suspected Voldemort was after it. Instead, he left it in place, protected by puzzles that any capable student could solve. The Chamber of Secrets. Dumbledore knew what the monster was from the beginning, but he allowed the crisis to escalate until students were being petrified. Molly Weasley made a sound of protest, but Hermione continued without pause. The Sirius Black situation is even worse. Dumbledore knew Sirius was innocent. He had to have known, given his connections to the Order of the Phoenix and his access to information. But he allowed Harry to spend an entire year believing his godfather wanted to kill him, allowed Sirius to remain in hiding and danger, all so that Harry could have another test of character. Hermione, Ron said plaintively, you can't seriously believe— I believe in evidence, she snapped. And the evidence shows a pattern of manipulation that would be unconscionable in anyone, let alone someone entrusted with the care of children. Arthur Weasley cleared his throat. Cedric, I understand you're preparing formal testimony for the Wizengamot. What can we do to help? Testify yourselves if you're willing, Amos replied, opening his briefcase and withdrawing several scrolls of parchment. Amelia Bones has agreed to present the case, but she needs corroborating testimony from credible witnesses, people who have observed the pattern of endangerment, who can speak to the systematic nature of these incidents. I'll testify, Hermione said immediately. My research has turned up documentation that supports every claim you're making. As will I, Arthur added, ignoring his wife's sharp intake of breath. This isn't about loyalty to Dumbledore or disloyalty to him. This is about accountability and the protection of children. The conversation was interrupted by a sharp rap at the door. Arthur moved to answer it, and Cedric heard his surprised greeting. Miss Skeeter, what brings you here? Rita Skeeter swept into the kitchen like a force of nature, her quick quotes quill already dancing in the air beside her elaborate blonde curls. She wore robes of electric green that somehow managed to complement her jeweled spectacles, and her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Mr. Diggory, she exclaimed, as if encountering him here was the most delightful surprise imaginable. How fortuitous. I was hoping we might have a little chat about your upcoming testimony. The wizarding public is simply dying to hear your side of the story. Miss Skeeter? Cedric replied carefully, remembering the legal advice Amelia Bones had provided about dealing with the press. I'm not sure this is the appropriate time. Nonsense! But there's never been a more appropriate time. Here you are, a young man of impeccable reputation, preparing to challenge the most beloved figure in our society. Surely you want to ensure your perspective is properly represented? Arthur Weasley stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. Miss Skeeter, if you're here to sensationalize this situation or twist Cedric's words— Perish the thought! Rita's eyes glittered behind her spectacles. I'm here in the interest of truth, Mr. Weasley. Something that seems to be in short supply lately. Wouldn't you agree? For the next hour, Rita Skeeter conducted what could charitably be called an interview, and more accurately described as a carefully orchestrated performance. Her questions were sharp and leading, yet designed to elicit exactly the kinds of quotes that would make compelling headlines. But Cedric, guided by his father's whispered legal advice and his own careful preparation, managed to navigate the conversation without saying anything that could be used against him later. One final question, Mr. Diggory, Rita said, as her quill hovered expectantly. Are you prepared for the consequences of challenging Albus Dumbledore? This is a man with allies in every corner of the wizarding world, a man whose reputation for goodness and wisdom spans decades. Some would say you're committing social suicide. Cedric met her gaze steadily, thinking of Harry's angry betrayal, of Dumbledore's casual admission of manipulation, of all the children who might face similar dangers in the future if no one spoke up. "Miss Skeeter," he said quietly, "some things are more important than social acceptance. Truth is one of them. Justice is another. If standing up for both of those costs me my reputation or my future, then so be it." Rita's smile was predatory. "Oh, that's perfect. Absolutely perfect." As she prepared to leave, Hermione approached Cedric with a scroll of parchment in her hands. "This is a summary of my research," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Names, dates, documentation of every incident. Amelia Bones should have this before your testimony." "What about Harry?" Cedric asked. "He's going to see this as another betrayal." Hermione's expression was pained, but resolute. "Harry is my best friend, and I love him dearly." But love doesn't mean protecting someone from the truth, even when that truth hurts, or especially when that truth hurts. She paused, looking around the kitchen where the Weasleys were still debating in hushed voices, where Arthur and Molly were carefully not looking at each other, where Ron sat with his head in his hands. "Besides," she added softly, "if we don't ask these questions now, if we don't demand accountability now, then who will? And when?" Later that evening, as Cedric walked the deserted corridors of Hogwarts with Cho beside him, he reflected on how much had changed in the few weeks since the tournament. The castle felt different now, charged with tension and possibility, as if the very stones were holding their breath in anticipation of what was to come. "McGonagall asked to see me tomorrow," he told Cho, as they paused beside one of the tall windows overlooking the lake. "Or apparently she has some concerns she'd like to discuss privately." "About Dumbledore?" "About everything." Cedric's reflection looked back at him from the darkened glass, and for a moment he barely recognized the young man staring back. Gone was the confident prefect who had entered the Triwizard Tournament, seeking glory and recognition. In his place was someone older, more serious, carrying the weight of knowledge he had never wanted to possess. "Are you ready for this?" Cho asked, taking his hand. "Really ready? Once you testify, once this becomes public, there won't be any going back." Cedric squeezed her fingers, drawing strength from her presence. Around them, Hogwarts settled into its evening rhythm. Portraits whispering gossip, ghosts drifting through walls, the castle itself breathing with the deep and slow respiration of centuries. "I'm ready," he said finally. "Not because I want to be, not because I'm not terrified of what comes next, but because someone has to speak for Harry Potter, and for every other student who's been used as a pawn in Dumbledore's grand design. If that someone has to be me, then I'll find the courage to see it through." The reflection in the window showed two young people standing together against the darkness, their hands intertwined, their faces set with determination. Behind them, the ancient castle stretched away into shadow, full of secrets and mysteries and carefully orchestrated dangers. But for the first time since the graveyard, Cedric felt something that might have been hope. The truth had allies now. Justice had advocates. And somewhere in the balance between those forces and the weight of tradition and authority, the future of the wizarding world would be decided. The war was coming, and Cedric Diggory intended to be ready for it. Chapter 6. The Wizengamot Hearing. Opening Arguments. The Wizengamot courtroom had not seen this much attention since the trials that followed Voldemort's first fall. Every seat in the public gallery was occupied, with wizards and witches pressed shoulder to shoulder, their faces reflecting the full spectrum of opinion that had polarized the magical community over the past month. Some wore expressions of righteous indignation. How dare this boy challenge their greatest hero? Others showed curiosity, doubt, or even open support for the young man who had dared to ask uncomfortable questions about uncomfortable truths. Cedric sat in the witness chair at the center of the circular chamber, the chains that had once bound Harry Potter during his disciplinary hearing now lying loose and inactive. Above him, the tiered benches of the Wizengamot rose in concentric circles, filled with 50 of the most powerful witches and wizards in magical Britain. Their plum-coloured robes seemed to absorb the torchlight, making them appear like shadows sitting in judgment over the proceedings. At the highest point of the chamber, Amelia Bones occupied the Chief Warlock's seat, a position she held temporarily due to Albus Dumbledore's necessary recusal from his own hearing. Her stern face was carefully neutral as she surveyed the packed courtroom, but Cedric caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she understood exactly how historic this moment was. "The emergency session of the Wizengamot will come to order," Bones announced, her voice magically amplified to reach every corner of the chamber. "We are here to examine formal allegations brought by Mr. Cedric Amos Diggory regarding the conduct of Professor Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore in matters concerning the safety and welfare of students at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." A ripple of whispers ran through the public gallery, quickly hushed as Bones fixed them with a sharp stare. "Let the record show that Professor Dumbledore has recused himself from his position as Chief Warlock for the duration of these proceedings and is present as the respondent, represented by Senior Advocate Kingsley Shacklebolt and the firm of Clearwater, Bones and Associates." Cedric glanced toward the defendant's section, now where Dumbledore sat with calm dignity, his hands folded in his lap and his expression serene. Beside him, Kingsley Shacklebolt, a powerful wizard whom Cedric recognized from ministry functions, shuffled through a stack of parchments with the confident manner of someone who believed his case was unassailable. "The complainant, Mr. Diggory, is represented by Senior Advocate Augusta Longbottom and the Office of Magical Child Welfare." Bones nodded toward the prosecution table, where Neville's formidable grandmother sat with ramrod-straight posture, her vulture-topped hat replaced by the severe black robes of a senior advocate. Cedric had been surprised when Augusta Longbottom had volunteered to represent him, until she'd explained with fierce determination that anyone who endangered children would answer to her, regardless of their reputation. "Mr. Diggory," Bones continued, "you may begin your testimony." Cedric rose from the witness chair, his legs slightly unsteady, despite weeks of preparation for this moment. The chamber fell absolutely silent, the weight of 50 pairs of eyes settling on him like a physical presence. In the public gallery, he could see his father's encouraging nod, Cho Chang's supportive smile, and the faces of other allies who had gathered to witness this confrontation. He could also see the skeptics, the Dumbledore loyalists, who had come expecting to watch a traumatized teenager make a fool of himself with wild accusations against their beloved leader. "Members of the Wizengamot," Cedric began, his voice steadier than he had dared hope. "On the evening of June 24th, 1995, as I was transported against my will to a graveyard in Little Hangleton, where I witnessed the return of the Dark Lord Voldemort to physical form." Several members of the Wizengamot shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Despite the widespread knowledge of Voldemort's return, hearing it spoken aloud in this formal setting still carried weight. "During the course of that evening, I overheard specific statements made by the Dark Lord to his followers, statements that revealed not only his methods for returning to power, but the extent to which his plans had been anticipated, and, I believe, deliberately facilitated by Professor Albus Dumbledore." The whispers in the gallery grew louder now, a susurrus of shock and disbelief that Bones had to quiet with another sharp look. "Specifically," Cedric continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "I heard Voldemort boast that the old fool played right into our hands, knowing full well what the tournament truly was. He spoke of Dumbledore's understanding that Voldemort would use Harry Potter's blood in his resurrection, and how this knowledge was not a barrier to Dumbledore's plans, but an essential component of them." Augusta Longbottom rose from the prosecution table. "Mr. Diggory, please tell the Wizengamot what conclusions you drew from these statements." That Professor Dumbledore possessed foreknowledge of the plot to use the Triwizard Tournament as a means of delivering Harry Potter to Voldemort, Cedric replied. That this foreknowledge did not prompt him to take preventive action, but rather to ensure that the plot succeeded according to his own strategic objectives. A voice from the Wizengamot benches called out, "That's a serious accusation, young man. Do you have any evidence beyond the alleged statements of a known liar and manipulator?" Augusta Longbottom was ready for this objection. "If it please the court, we would like to present a pattern of evidence showing systematic endangerment of students, particularly Harry Potter, that supports our client's interpretation of the events in question." Bones nodded. "You may proceed." For the next 2 hours, Augusta Longbottom methodically laid out the case against Dumbledore with the precision of a master prosecutor. She presented newspaper clippings documenting each crisis that had befallen Hogwarts during Harry's tenure. She read testimony from former students describing the inadequate security measures that had allowed dangerous situations to escalate. She presented analysis from curse breakers and security experts who testified that most of the threats could have been neutralized before they endangered student lives. "The pattern is clear," Augusta declared, her voice ringing through the chamber. "In every instance where Harry Potter faced mortal danger, Professor Dumbledore possessed both the knowledge and the authority to prevent that danger, yet chose instead to allow events to proceed until the child was forced to resolve the crisis himself." When it came time for witness testimony, Madame Pomfrey took the stand with obvious reluctance, her usually cheerful demeanor replaced by the grim determination of someone who had wrestled with her conscience and chosen to speak. "Madame Pomfrey," Augusta asked gently, "in your capacity as school mediwitch, have you maintained records of injuries treated among the student body?" "I have," Poppy replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "And what do those records show regarding Harry Potter's medical history during his time at Hogwarts?" The Mediwitch's hands trembled as she consulted her notes. "Mr. Potter has been treated for more life-threatening injuries than any student in Hogwarts' recorded history. Severe magical exhaustion, multiple bone fractures, basilisk venom poisoning, Dementor exposure, cursor damage." Her voice trailed off, and she looked directly at Dumbledore with pain in her eyes. "But in 23 years as school mediwitch, I have never seen a pattern like this. In your professional opinion, could these injuries have been prevented through different administrative decisions?" Poppy Pomfrey's answer was barely audible, but it carried to every corner of the silent chamber. "Yes." The most difficult testimony came from Professor McGonagall, who approached the witness stand with the bearing of someone walking to her own execution. Her face was pale but resolute as she placed her hand on the magical oath crystal and swore to speak truthfully. "Professor McGonagall," Augusta said with obvious sympathy, "you have served as deputy headmistress under Professor Dumbledore for many years. Have you ever expressed concerns to him about student safety?" McGonagall's voice was tight with controlled emotion. "I have, and repeatedly. Can you give this court specific examples when Harry Potter was placed with his relatives, despite my observations of their unsuitable nature? When the Philosopher's Stone was kept at Hogwarts, despite obvious security risks? When the school remained open during the Chamber of Secrets crisis? When Dementors were allowed on the grounds?" McGonagall's voice broke slightly. "When Harry's name came out of the Goblet of Fire, I argued that he should be withdrawn from the tournament. Professor Dumbledore overruled me. And what was his reasoning for these decisions?" McGonagall looked directly at her longtime colleague and friend, tears glistening in her eyes. "He said that Harry needed to learn to face such challenges, that shielding him would only delay the inevitable confrontation with Voldemort. He spoke of preparing the boy for his destiny." The silence that followed was profound. In the public gallery, even Dumbledore's most ardent supporters looked shaken by the testimony of someone so close to him. Kingsley Shacklebolt rose for the defense, his deep voice carrying easily through the chamber. "Honorable members of the Wizengamot, The prosecution would have you believe that one of the greatest wizards of our age is guilty of child endangerment and educational malpractice. They present a series of crises and ask you to assume malicious intent where none exists. He began to pace before the Wizengamot benches, his presence commanding attention. But what they fail to acknowledge is the broader context in which these decisions were made. Professor Dumbledore was not operating in a vacuum. He was preparing for a war that he knew was coming, was against an enemy who had already targeted Harry Potter specifically. Shacklebolt gestured toward Dumbledore, who maintained his serene composure throughout the proceedings. Every decision Professor Dumbledore made was guided by one overriding principle: ensuring that when the inevitable confrontation came, Harry Potter would be prepared to survive it. The alternative, keeping the boy in ignorant safety, would have guaranteed his death when Voldemort finally found him. The defense would like to call Professor Dumbledore himself to explain his actions and the reasoning behind them. Dumbledore rose with dignity and approached the witness stand, his movement slow but sure. As he placed his hand on the oath crystal, a subtle change seemed to come over the courtroom. Even his critics found themselves leaning forward, or drawn by the magnetic presence that had made him a leader for so many decades. "Members of the Wizengamot," Dumbledore began, his voice carrying the weight of years and hard-won wisdom, "I do not deny the basic facts presented by the prosecution. Harry Potter has indeed faced dangers during his time at Hogwarts that would challenge experienced adult wizards. I do not deny that I possessed foreknowledge of some of these dangers, or that I sometimes chose not to intervene directly when intervention might have prevented them." A murmur of surprise ran through the chamber. Few had expected such direct admissions. "What I ask you to consider," Dumbledore continued, "is the alternative. Harry Potter was marked for death before his second birthday, as a prophecy spoken before his birth declared that he would face Voldemort in a final confrontation, a confrontation that neither could survive. Given this inescapable destiny, what would have been the greater cruelty? To shield him from all hardship until that final moment when he would face the Dark Lord wholly unprepared, or to ensure that he developed the strength, courage, and moral foundation necessary to make the right choice when that moment came?" He looked around the chamber, his blue eyes seeming to meet each person's gaze individually. Every trial Harry has faced has prepared him for the ultimate test. Every victory has built his confidence. Every act of sacrifice and courage has strengthened the magical protection that his mother's love bestowed upon him. The boy who entered Hogwarts could not have survived what awaited him in that graveyard. The young man who emerged from it now carries within himself the power to defeat the darkest wizard of our age. "But at what cost?" Augusta Longbottom's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Professor Dumbledore, you speak of Harry Potter's destiny as if it excuses any amount of suffering, any degree of manipulation. You've treated this child as a weapon to be forged, rather than a person to be protected." Dumbledore's expression grew infinitely sad. "I have made choices that haunt me every day, Madam Longbottom, but I have made them in service of preventing a far greater darkness from consuming our world. If that makes me guilty in the eyes of this court, then I accept that judgment." The formal arguments concluded with Augusta Longbottom's closing statement, delivered with the passion of someone who had seen too many children suffer in the name of adult priorities. "Members of the Wizengamot, this case is not ultimately about Albus Dumbledore's intentions, which I believe were genuinely aimed at protecting our world from darkness. This case is about accountability, and about the principle that no one, regardless of their power, their wisdom, or their noble goals, has the right to gamble with children's lives without their knowledge or consent." She gestured toward Cedric, who had remained in the witness section throughout the day's proceedings. "Mr. Diggory nearly died for the sake of Professor Dumbledore's grand strategy. Harry Potter has been repeatedly placed in mortal danger for the same reason. How many other children must be sacrificed on the altar of the greater good before we say that enough is enough." As the formal session concluded and the Wizengamot retired to consider their verdict, Cedric found himself surrounded by a crush of reporters and supporters in the atrium outside the courtroom. The questions came from all directions, sharp, probing, desperate for quotes that would shape tomorrow's headlines. But through the chaos, Cedric caught sight of a familiar figure standing alone near one of the great fireplaces. Harry Potter had come to witness the proceedings, his face pale and his eyes filled with something that might have been understanding, or might have been betrayal. Their eyes met across the crowded atrium, and for a moment, what the rest of the world fell away. In Harry's expression, Cedric saw the terrible cost of truth, the shattering of illusions, the painful recognition that the adults they had trusted with their lives had been playing a game far more complex and dangerous than either boy had ever imagined. Then Harry turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd without a word. The first day of the trial was over, but Cedric knew that the real test, the test of whether the wizarding world was ready to hold its heroes accountable for their choices, was only just beginning. Chapter 7. Uncomfortable Truths. The second day of the hearing dawned grey and oppressive, as if the very sky reflected the mood of the wizarding world, grappling with revelations that challenged everything they thought they knew about their greatest hero. Cedric arrived at the ministry early, finding the atrium already crowded with witches and wizards clutching copies of the Daily Prophet, their faces bearing expressions that ranged from outrage to confusion to dawning horror. The headline stretched across the front page in letters that seemed to burn: "Dumbledore on trial, hero or manipulator." Below it, Rita Skeeter's article detailed every damaging revelation from the previous day's testimony, complete with direct quotes from Professor McGonagall and Madame Pomfrey that painted a picture of systematic endangerment spanning 4 years. In the Wizengamot chamber, the atmosphere was noticeably more tense than it had been during the opening arguments. Several members of the court appeared to have spent a sleepless night, wrestling with the implications of what they had heard, while others had clearly hardened their positions in defense of their longtime ally. "The court will hear testimony from Professor Severus Snape," Amelia Bones announced, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation that had filled the chamber. A ripple of surprise ran through the public gallery. Snape had been notably absent from Dumbledore's list of character witnesses, and his presence now suggested that Augusta Longbottom had uncovered something significant. The potions master entered the chamber with his characteristic billowing robes and sneering demeanor, but Cedric noticed something different about him, a tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his dark eyes that suggested he was deeply uncomfortable with whatever he was about to reveal. Snape took the oath with obvious reluctance, his pale hand hovering over the crystal as if it might burn him. "Professor Snape," Augusta Longbottom began, her voice gentler than usual, "you have served under Professor Dumbledore's leadership for many years. Have you ever received specific instructions from him regarding the treatment of Harry Potter?" Snape's jaw tightened. "I have." "Could you describe the nature of those instructions?" For a long moment, Snape remained silent, his black eyes fixed on some point above the Wizengamot benches. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I was instructed to maintain a challenging relationship with Mr. Potter, to ensure that he did not develop an inflated sense of his own importance." "Can you be more specific about what Professor Dumbledore meant by challenging?" Snape's hands clenched at his sides. He believed that Potter's fame and natural talent could lead to arrogance. He wanted the boy to remain humble, to understand that his abilities came with responsibility and sacrifice. "My role was to provide that perspective." Augusta Longbottom consulted her notes. "Professor Snape, in your professional opinion as an educator, did these instructions require you to act in ways that might be considered psychologically harmful to a child?" The question hung in the air like a curse. Snape's face had gone even paler than usual, and his voice, when it came, was strained with an emotion that Cedric couldn't quite identify. Yes. The single word fell into absolute silence. In the public gallery, Cedric could see Harry Potter sitting rigid in his seat, his face white with shock. For 4 years, the boy had endured Snape's cruelty, or believing it was personal animosity or simple malice, to learn that it had been orchestrated, that his suffering had been deliberate policy. Professor Snape, Augusta continued relentlessly, did Professor Dumbledore ever express concern about the psychological impact of this treatment on Mr. Potter? Snape's answer was barely audible. He said that the boy needed to be prepared for disappointment and hardship, that it would make him stronger in the long run. And did you ever question these instructions? No. Snape's voice was hollow. I believed they served a greater purpose. The next witness was even more devastating, precisely because his intentions were so obviously good. Hagrid shambled into the chamber with his characteristic mixture of nervousness and confusion, his massive hands twisting his moleskin overcoat as he settled into the witness chair with obvious difficulty. Hagrid, Augusta said gently, recognizing that this witness required careful handling. You've been a loyal friend to Professor Dumbledore for many decades. Has he ever asked you to perform specific tasks related to Harry Potter's safety? Oh, loads of times, Hagrid replied with enthusiastic honesty. Always looking out for Harry. Professor Dumbledore is. Always wanting to make sure the boy's all right. Can you give us some specific examples? Hagrid's face brightened. Well, there was the time with Fluffy. That's me, three-headed dog, you know. Professor Dumbledore asked me to tell Harry how to get past him, in case the boy ever needed to protect the stone, or said it was important Harry knew how to defend himself. A murmur of disbelief ran through the chamber. Augusta Longbottom's voice remained carefully neutral. Professor Dumbledore asked you to tell Harry Potter how to get past a three-headed dog guarding the Philosopher's Stone. Not directly like, Hagrid said, his confusion evident, but he made sure I'd mention it if Harry asked, said the boy might need to know someday. And did this strike you as unusual? Hagrid scratched his wild beard. Well, I thought it was a bit odd, given an 11-year-old advice about getting past a three-headed dog. But Professor Dumbledore always knows best, doesn't he? Always has his reasons. The questioning continued, and with each answer, Hagrid unknowingly revealed another piece of Dumbledore's careful orchestration. How he'd been instructed to mention the name Nicholas Flamel within Harry's hearing. How he'd been told to keep Norbert's egg precisely long enough for Harry to discover it. How he'd been given specific instructions about what information to share regarding the Chamber of Secrets, the tournament, even Sirius Black's escape. In every case, Hagrid concluded with painful honesty, Professor Dumbledore said it was for Harry's own good. Said the boy needed to learn things gradually, in his own way. By the time Hagrid left the witness chair, even some of Dumbledore's staunchest supporters in the gallery looked shaken. The picture emerging was not of a benevolent headmaster protecting his students, but of a master manipulator who had orchestrated every major crisis in Harry Potter's education. Yet the most dramatic testimony of the day came via magical communication with Sirius Black, whose voice echoed through the chamber from an undisclosed location where he remained in hiding from ministry authorities who still officially considered him a fugitive. Mr. Black, Augusta Longbottom said formally, you understand that your testimony today is given under oath and may be used in these proceedings? I understand, Sirius's voice replied, carrying clearly despite the magical static of the long-distance communication spell. And I want it on record that I've waited 12 years to tell this truth. Please describe your interactions with Professor Dumbledore following your escape from Azkaban prison. There was a pause, during which Cedric could almost feel the tension radiating from Harry's section of the gallery. Dumbledore knew I was innocent, Sirius said flatly. Not suspected, knew. He had the evidence to clear my name within days of my escape, but he chose not to use it. The explosion of voices from the gallery forced Amelia Bones to call for order. "That's a serious allegation, Mr. Black. What evidence do you have to support it?" Peter Pettigrew was at Hogwarts, in his animagus form, for the entire school year. Dumbledore is a skilled legilimens. He could have extracted the truth from Pettigrew's mind at any time. He could have forced him to transform in front of witnesses. Instead, he allowed me to remain a fugitive, allowed my godson to believe I was trying to kill him because it served his purposes. Sirius's voice grew harsh with years of suppressed anger. Harry needed to believe he was in danger, you see, or needed to feel isolated, dependent on Dumbledore's protection. My clearing would have given Harry a guardian, a family member who could have removed him from the Dursleys' care or challenged Dumbledore's decisions. That didn't fit the plan. "What plan?" Augusta asked, though Cedric suspected she already knew the answer. "The plan to keep Harry Potter alone, frightened, and grateful for whatever scraps of affection and protection Dumbledore chose to provide. A boy with a loving family doesn't make the same choices as a boy who believes he has nothing left to lose." In the public gallery, Harry Potter stood abruptly and walked out, his face set in lines of devastation that made Cedric's heart ache. Several other spectators followed him, including Hermione Granger, whose face was streaked with tears. The rest of Sirius's testimony painted a picture of calculated isolation that was almost more damaging than the physical dangers Harry had faced. Every potential source of support, godfather, friends, families, even romantic interests, had been either eliminated or carefully managed to ensure that Harry remained dependent on Dumbledore's approval and guidance. The boy was systematically prevented from forming the kind of bonds that might have given him the strength to question authority, Sirius concluded. And when those bonds formed anyway, with the Weasleys, with his friends, they were manipulated to reinforce his sense of obligation to the wizarding world, rather than his right to choose his own path. When the formal session ended for the day, Cedric found himself walking the ministry corridors in a daze, or the testimony he had heard went beyond anything he had imagined when he first decided to speak out. This wasn't just about a few dangerous incidents or poor judgment calls. This was about a systematic program of psychological manipulation that had shaped every aspect of Harry Potter's development. He found Harry in a small courtyard behind the ministry building, sitting on a stone bench with his head in his hands. Hermione sat beside him, one hand resting gently on his shoulder as he struggled with revelations that were rewriting his understanding of his own life. "Harry," Cedric said quietly, approaching the bench. Harry looked up, and Cedric saw that the younger boy's eyes were red with unshed tears. "You were right," Harry said, his voice hollow, "about all of it. Every word you said was true." "I wish I hadn't been," Cedric replied honestly, sitting down on Harry's other side. "I wish I'd been wrong about everything." "Snape," Harry's voice cracked. "For years I thought he hated me because of my father, because of some old grudge. And all along, he was just following orders. Dumbledore's orders." Hermione's voice was thick with tears. "The worst part is knowing that Snape never wanted to hurt you. You could see it in his face when he was testifying. He hated every moment of it. But he did it because he believed Dumbledore when he said it was necessary." Harry laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "And Hagrid. Dear, sweet Hagrid, who thought he was helping by giving me information that would put me in mortal danger. Who never realized he was being used to manipulate an 11-year-old into walking into traps. Harry, don't." Harry held up a hand, stopping whatever words of comfort Cedric had been about to offer. "Don't tell me it's going to be all right, or that Dumbledore meant well, or any of the things people say when they can't face how bad something really is." He stood up, pacing to the edge of the courtyard and staring out at the London skyline beyond the ministry's boundaries. "Do you know what the worst part is?" Harry asked without turning around. "It's not that he manipulated me or put me in danger, or even that he cost Sirius 12 years of freedom. It's that it worked." Cedric frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean that every choice he forced me to make, every test he put me through, at every moment of isolation and fear, it did exactly what he intended it to do. I am stronger because of it. I am more willing to sacrifice myself for others because of it. I am exactly the weapon he needed me to become." Harry turned back to face them, and Cedric saw something in his eyes that looked like understanding, mixed with despair. "He turned me into someone who would walk into that graveyard willingly. Someone who would let Voldemort use my blood, because protecting others mattered more than protecting myself. And the terrible thing is," Harry's voice dropped to a whisper, "the terrible thing is that he was right. The wizarding world does need someone willing to make that sacrifice. It just shouldn't have been an orphaned child who never had any other choice." The three of them sat in silence as the sun set over London, as each lost in their own thoughts about the revelations that had shattered their understanding of the man they had all, in different ways, looked up to as a hero and protector. When they finally parted ways, Cedric walked home through the darkening streets with a heavy heart. Tomorrow would bring more testimony, more uncomfortable truths, and eventually a verdict that would determine Dumbledore's fate and the future of accountability in the wizarding world. But tonight, he couldn't stop thinking about Harry's words, about the terrible effectiveness of Dumbledore's methods, and about the question that lay at the heart of everything they were doing. If those methods had been necessary to save the wizarding world, did that make them right? And if they were wrong, what did that say about the world they had saved? The truth, what Cedric was learning, was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. But complicated or not, it was still the truth, and someone had to be willing to speak it, whatever the cost. Chapter 8. The Defence's Gambit. The third day of the hearing began with a noticeable shift in the atmosphere of the Wizengamot chamber. Where the previous sessions had been marked by shocked whispers and mounting horror at each revelation, today carried the tension of a battle about to be joined. Kingsley Shacklebolt entered the courtroom with the confident bearing of a man who believed he held the winning hand, his deep purple robes immaculate, and his expression grave but determined. Cedric watched from the witness gallery as Dumbledore's defense team arranged their materials with military precision. Scrolls of parchment covered their table, yet along with what appeared to be several glowing orbs that pulsed with soft silver light. Memory extracts, Cedric realized, probably containing testimonies from wizards too important or too distant to appear in person. "Members of the Wizengamot," Kingsley began, his rich voice carrying easily to every corner of the chamber. "Over the past 2 days, you have heard testimony that paints Professor Albus Dumbledore as a manipulator and child endangerer. You have heard witnesses describe decisions that, when viewed in isolation, appear callous or even cruel." He paused, allowing his gaze to sweep across the tiered benches where 50 of Wizarding Britain's most powerful citizens sat in judgment. But context, honourable members, is everything. And the context in which Professor Dumbledore made these decisions was nothing less than a war for the very survival of our world. Kingsley moved to the centre of the chamber, his presence commanding attention, even from those who had seemed most convinced by the prosecution's case. "The defense calls upon this court to examine a prophecy recorded in the Department of Mysteries and witnessed by Professor Dumbledore himself that has shaped every decision he has made regarding Harry Potter since the boy's birth." A glass orb materialized on the witness stand, its surface swirling with pearlescent mist. As the chamber fell silent, a hollow voice echoed from within it. The voice of Sybil Trelawney, though deeper and more resonant than her usual tones. "The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches. Were born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies, and the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal. But he will have power the Dark Lord knows not, and either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives." The silence that followed was absolute. Even those who had supported Cedric's testimony looked shaken by the stark finality of those words. "Neither can live while the other survives," Kingsley repeated, his voice heavy with significance. "Members of the Wizengamot, this was not Professor Dumbledore's choice. This was not his preference or his plan. This was fate itself, spoken through the ancient magic of true prophecy. Harry Potter was destined to face Lord Voldemort in mortal combat, and the only question was whether he would face that destiny prepared or unprepared." Augusta Longbottom rose from the prosecution table. "Objection. The existence of a prophecy does not justify child endangerment. Professor Dumbledore could have prepared Harry Potter through proper training, proper support, proper—" "Could he?" Kingsley interrupted smoothly. "The defense would like to call Professor Minerva McGonagall to address that very question." McGonagall returned to the witness stand with obvious reluctance, her face pale but composed. She had testified for the prosecution about her concerns regarding Dumbledore's methods, but now she was being asked to defend the man she had served loyally for decades. "Professor McGonagall," Kingsley said gently, "you have expressed concerns about some of Professor Dumbledore's decisions. But do you believe he could have prepared Harry Potter for his destined confrontation with Voldemort through conventional means?" McGonagall was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "No," she said finally. "Conventional training would not have been sufficient. The boy needed to understand sacrifice, needed to choose repeatedly to stand against darkness, even when it cost him dearly. He needed to learn that he could survive the unthinkable, that he could triumph over impossible odds, not because he was protected from them, but because he chose to face them. And could this understanding have been taught in a classroom? No." McGonagall's voice grew stronger. "It could only be learned through experience. Terrible, a dangerous experience that I wish with all my heart had not been necessary. But—" She looked directly at Dumbledore, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But I believe it was necessary. I believe every trial Harry faced made him stronger, made him more capable of surviving what awaited him." The next witness appeared via pensive memory, Alastor Mad-Eye Moody, his magical eye spinning wildly as he spoke from what appeared to be his home. "Dumbledore!" Moody's gruff voice filled the chamber. "Best strategist I've ever known. Could see 13 moves ahead when the rest of us were still figuring out the board. Every decision he made was calculated to give us the best chance of winning a war we were losing." The memory Moody leaned forward, his scarred face intense with conviction. "You think he enjoyed putting that boy in danger? You think it was easy for him to watch a child face what Harry Potter has faced? I've known Albus Dumbledore for 40 years, and I've never seen him make a decision that didn't cost him something. But he made them anyway, because someone had to, and he was the only one with the courage and the vision to see what needed to be done." More testimonies followed, Remus Lupin speaking of Dumbledore's guidance during his own dark times, Kingsley himself describing the headmaster's leadership during the First War against Voldemort, even a message from Nicholas Flamel praising Dumbledore's wisdom in choosing to destroy the Philosopher's Stone, rather than keep it safe. But it was when Kingsley addressed Cedric directly that the chamber truly erupted. "Mr. Diggory," Kingsley said, turning to face him, "you have claimed that your survival in that graveyard was accidental, that Professor Dumbledore had no way of knowing you would live to bear witness to Voldemort's statements. But the defense submits that your survival was not accidental at all. It was part of Professor Dumbledore's plan from the very beginning." Cedric felt his blood turn to ice. "That's impossible," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the silent chamber. "Professor Dumbledore had no way of knowing that Harry would tackle me out of the way of Pettigrew's curse." "Didn't he?" Kingsley smiled, pulling out a scroll of parchment. "The defense would like to present evidence that Professor Dumbledore placed a powerful protection charm on the Triwizard Cup before the final task, a charm designed to ensure that anyone transported by it would survive their first encounter with mortal danger. The scroll unrolled to reveal what appeared to be a detailed magical analysis of the cup, complete with glowing symbols that indicated the presence of advanced protective enchantments. This analysis was conducted by the Department of Mysteries after the tournament concluded, Kingsley continued. It shows clearly that the cup carried not one, but two different magical signatures, Barty Crouch Jr.'s portkey charm, and a far more subtle protection that could only have been placed by someone of Professor Dumbledore's extraordinary ability. Augusta Longbottom leaped to her feet. "This is the first we're hearing of this evidence. Where was this analysis during the prosecution's preparation?" "The analysis was classified," Kingsley replied smoothly. "But Professor Dumbledore has waived his right to secrecy in the interest of truth. The fact remains that he ensured Mr. Diggory's survival, knowing that a witness to Voldemort's statements would be essential to validating Mr. Potter's claims about the Dark Lord's return." Cedric stared at the scroll, his mind reeling. If this was true, then even his testimony, the very foundation of this entire hearing, had been orchestrated by the man they were trying to hold accountable. "You're saying he planned for me to nearly die?" Cedric asked, his voice hollow. "I'm saying he planned for you to survive," Kingsley corrected. "He knew the risks. He took steps to mitigate them. And he ensured that truth would have a voice when the time came to convince the world of Voldemort's return." The chamber buzzed with confused voices as people tried to process this latest revelation. If Dumbledore had indeed planned for Cedric to witness and survive Voldemort's gloating, then what did that say about the entire case they had built against him? Finally, Dumbledore himself took the stand, moving with slow dignity to the witness chair. At nearly 115 years old, he looked every one of his years, but his blue eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had guided the wizarding world through its darkest hours. "Professor Dumbledore," Kingsley said formally, "did you place protective enchantments on the Triwizard Cup before the final task?" "I did," Dumbledore replied simply. "And did you do so knowing that Mr. Diggory would likely be transported along with Harry Potter?" "I suspected it was possible. The cup had been tampered with to become a portkey, but the specific destination and timing were unknown to me. I took what precautions I could to ensure that any student transported would have the best chance of survival." "Professor Dumbledore," Kingsley continued, "you have heard testimony over the past 3 days, describing your actions as manipulation and endangerment. How do you respond to these charges?" Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving across the faces in the crowded chamber, members of the Wizengamot, reporters, students, parents, allies and critics alike. "I do not deny that I have made choices that put young people in danger," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of decades of difficult decisions. "I do not deny that I have withheld information, manipulated circumstances, and allowed events to unfold in ways that might have been prevented through direct intervention." A murmur of surprise ran through the gallery at this direct admission. "But I would ask this court to consider the alternative," Dumbledore continued. "If I had not prepared Harry Potter for his inevitable confrontation with Voldemort, if I had not ensured that he understood the nature of sacrifice and the power of choice, what would have been the result when that prophecy demanded fulfillment?" He looked directly at Cedric, his eyes filled with something that might have been regret or might have been resolve. "Mr. Diggory asks whether the ends justify the means. It is a fair question, and one I have asked myself every day for 15 years. My answer is this: I do not know if they justify them, but I know that without those means, there would have been no end to justify. Voldemort would have returned to a world unprepared for him, and Harry Potter would have faced him as an untrained child rather than as the young man he has become." "Do you regret your choices, Professor?" Kingsley asked. "I regret their necessity," Dumbledore replied. "I regret that we live in a world where such choices must be made. I regret every moment of pain I have caused to children who deserved better, but I do not regret making the choices that gave us the best chance of surviving the darkness that threatened to consume everything we hold dear." He paused, his gaze sweeping the chamber one final time, as the prosecution suggests that I treated Harry Potter as a weapon rather than a person. Perhaps they are right, but weapons can be sheathed when the battle is won. If I had treated him only as a person, a child to be protected and sheltered, he would be dead now, and Voldemort would rule over the ashes of our world. When Dumbledore stepped down from the witness stand, the chamber was absolutely silent. Cedric found himself staring at the old wizard with a mixture of admiration and revulsion that left him feeling sick to his stomach. The terrible thing was that Dumbledore's argument made sense. Not morally, perhaps, but strategically, practically, in the cold calculus of war and survival. If the prophecy was real, and there was no reason to doubt its authenticity, then Harry Potter had always been destined to face Voldemort alone. Given that inevitability, perhaps Dumbledore's methods had been not just justified, but necessary. But that didn't make them right. It didn't erase the suffering they had caused or the trust they had betrayed, and it didn't answer the fundamental question that lay at the heart of everything they were debating. Who had the right to make such choices for others? Who had the authority to decide that a child's pain was acceptable collateral damage in service of the greater good? As the court recessed for deliberation, Cedric found himself no longer certain what verdict he was hoping for. The truth, he was learning, was far more complicated than the simple narrative of good and evil that had driven him to seek justice in the first place. And tomorrow, 50 of the most powerful wizards and witches in Britain would have to decide whether that complexity was enough to excuse the inexcusable, or whether some principles were too important to compromise, regardless of the consequences. Chapter 9. The Student Rebellion. The owl arrived at Luna Lovegood's home just after breakfast, on a morning that was already promising to be uncomfortably warm. Luna recognized the neat handwriting immediately. Hermione Granger, though they had never been particularly close, was the kind of person whose penmanship was as precise and organized as her thoughts. "Luna, I hope this letter finds you well. I'm writing to you because I believe you are one of the few people at Hogwarts who sees things clearly, without the prejudices that cloud most people's judgment. And by now you've probably heard about Cedric Diggory's testimony against Professor Dumbledore. I've been researching the evidence, and I believe Cedric is right, that we've all been manipulated and endangered for years while the adults we trusted looked the other way. I think the students deserve to have their voices heard in this matter. Would you be willing to help organize a response? Yours truly, Hermione Granger." Luna set the letter down carefully beside her bowl of porridge and considered this request. Around her, the Lovegood kitchen hummed with its usual collection of oddities. Butterflies that had taken up residence in the hanging plants, a radio that occasionally broadcast what her father insisted were transmissions from other dimensions, and a collection of turnips that were supposedly capable of warding off Nargles, but seemed more interested in sprouting eyes. "Daddy," Luna said thoughtfully, "do you think adults are capable of admitting when they're wrong about something important?" Xenophilius Lovegood looked up from the latest issue of the Quibbler, his wispy hair more dishevelled than usual. "Adults, my dear Luna, have a terrible tendency to mistake being older for being wiser. They confuse authority with correctness." Luna nodded, unsurprised by this assessment. Her father had never been one to trust conventional wisdom, and his skepticism of established authority had always seemed perfectly reasonable to her. "I think," Luna said, reaching for a quill, "that Hermione Granger has had an excellent idea." By evening, the Howells were crisscrossing Britain, carrying copies of what would later be known as the Hogwarts Student Declaration. Luna's prose style was unique, but her message was crystal clear. "We, the students of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, have watched the testimony regarding Professor Albus Dumbledore's conduct with great interest and growing concern. Many of us have personally experienced the dangers that Mr. Cedric Diggory has brought to public attention. We believe it is time for student voices to be heard in this matter. We do not question Professor Dumbledore's intentions or his genuine desire to protect the wizarding world. However, we reject the notion that students should be sacrificed, physically or psychologically, for the greater good without our knowledge or consent. We call upon the wizarding community to recognize that children are not weapons to be forged in the fires of carefully orchestrated trauma. We are people, deserving of truth, protection, and the right to make informed choices about our own lives. We stand with Cedric Diggory in demanding accountability from those who hold power over our lives and our futures. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By the next morning, Luna had received over 200 replies from students across all 4 houses and multiple year levels. Some were brief expressions of support, but others were detailed accounts of dangerous situations that students had faced, while adults who should have protected them remained mysteriously absent. The most surprising response came from an unexpected quarter. Lovegood. I never thought I'd find myself agreeing with anything a Ravenclaw dreamer had to say, but your letter raises points that even a Slytherin can appreciate. Dumbledore's methods have always struck me as inefficient. A truly skilled manipulator doesn't allow his subjects to discover they're being manipulated. The fact that Potter has stumbled through so many life-threatening situations while believing himself to be unlucky rather than targeted suggests either incompetence or deliberate cruelty on the headmaster's part. From a purely strategic standpoint, Diggory's testimony represents an opportunity to restructure the power dynamics at Hogwarts in a way that might actually serve student interests for once. You have my support, for what it's worth. De Malfoy. Luna read Draco's letter twice, not because she found it difficult to understand, but because she wanted to appreciate the full complexity of his position. Here was a boy who had been raised to respect authority and pure blood supremacy, yet was willing to support accountability over tradition when presented with evidence of systemic failure. She showed the letter to her father, who chuckled appreciatively. Slytherins, he said with something approaching fondness, will always choose effective power over ceremonial power. Young Malfoy has recognized that Dumbledore's influence is waning, and he's positioning himself accordingly. Is that wrong? Luna asked. Not at all, my dear. In fact, it's rather encouraging. It suggests that this movement you're organizing transcends traditional political divisions. Luna's assessment of the situation's complexity deepened when she received a visit from Hermione Granger herself, who appeared at the Lovegood cottage via Floo powder, looking harried and determined. Luna, Hermione said without preamble, we have a problem. The Ministry is trying to suppress student involvement in the hearing. They're claiming that minors aren't competent to comment on complex political matters. How wonderfully patronizing of them, Luna replied calmly. I suppose they've forgotten that minors were the ones who faced the basilisk, the Dementors, and all the other dangers they're now pretending to be concerned about. Hermione's smile was sharp with approval. Exactly. Which is why I think we need to do something more dramatic than just letters. We need to make it impossible for them to ignore student voices. What they came up with was audacious in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. If the Ministry wouldn't listen to student testimony, then students would provide their own forum. The date chosen was July 30th, 3 days before the Wizengamot was scheduled to deliver its verdict. The location was Diagon Alley, specifically the space in front of Gringotts Bank, where hundreds of witches and wizards passed every day. Luna stood before a crowd that included not just students, but their parents, siblings, and other members of the wizarding community who had been following the hearing with growing unease. In her dreamy but penetrating voice, she began to speak about what it meant to be a student at Hogwarts during the years when danger had become a regular part of the curriculum. In my second year, Luna said. Students were being petrified by a basilisk that had been living in the school for decades. The teachers told us they didn't know what was happening, but they kept the school open. They kept us in danger while an 11-year-old boy was expected to solve a mystery that had baffled them. She was followed by Susan Bones, a Hufflepuff who spoke about the Dementors that had been stationed at Hogwarts during her 3rd year. They told us the Dementors were there for our protection, Susan said, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. But Dementors don't distinguish between innocent students and dangerous fugitives. We were traumatized day after day, while the adults who should have protected us called it necessary security. Dean Thomas stepped forward to describe the atmosphere of fear that had permeated the school during the Chamber of Secrets crisis. Neville Longbottom, his voice barely audible but his determination clear, spoke about watching his fellow students face dangers that trained Aurors would hesitate to confront. And then, in a moment that would be remembered as the turning point of the entire affair, Draco Malfoy took the makeshift platform and addressed the crowd with the calculating precision that had made his family feared throughout the wizarding world. "I am not here," Draco said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd, "just because I have any particular fondness for Harry Potter or sympathy for his sufferings. I am here because I recognize incompetent leadership when I see it." He paused, allowing his gaze to sweep across the faces before him. Students, parents, ministry officials who had stopped to listen. Professor Dumbledore claims to have orchestrated Potter's trials for the greater good, but a truly competent leader would have found ways to prepare Potter for his destiny without endangering dozens of other students in the process. A competent leader would not have allowed a basilisk to terrorize students for months while claiming ignorance. A competent leader would not have permitted Dementors on school grounds, regardless of ministry pressure. Draco's voice grew harder, more cutting. What we have witnessed is not strategic genius. It is the fumbling of an old man who has confused sentiment with wisdom, who has prioritized dramatic gestures over effective results. If the wizarding world is to survive the challenges ahead, we need leadership that protects all students, not just the ones deemed narratively important. The speech was devastating in its clinical assessment, and all the more powerful for coming from someone who could not be accused of sentimental attachment to Dumbledore's victims. But it was the final speaker who provided the emotional climax that transformed the gathering from a protest into something approaching a movement. Harry Potter himself stepped onto the platform, his face pale but resolute. The crowd fell absolutely silent, recognizing that they were about to hear from the person at the center of all the controversy. "I want to thank Cedric Diggory," Harry said, his voice cracking slightly, "for having the courage to speak truths that I wasn't brave enough to face." He looked around at the sea of faces, his fellow students, their families, reporters who were frantically scribbling notes, ministry officials whose expressions ranged from sympathy to alarm. "For 4 years, I've been grateful to Professor Dumbledore for saving my life repeatedly. It never occurred to me to ask why I needed saving so often. It never occurred to me to wonder why an 11-year-old was expected to get past a 3-headed dog to protect a magical artifact, or why I was sent into a chamber full of deadly traps while trained curse breakers stood by and watched." Harry's voice grew stronger as he continued. "I thought I was unlucky. I thought I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I never realized that I was exactly where someone wanted me to be, facing exactly the dangers that someone had decided I needed to face." He paused, and when he spoke again, his words carried the weight of a young man who had been forced to grow up far too quickly. "I don't blame Professor Dumbledore for preparing me to face Voldemort. That confrontation was always going to happen. But I do blame him for making that preparation a secret, for denying me the right to understand what was being done to me and why. I blame him for putting other students in danger as part of his strategy. And I blame all of us, myself included, for accepting that children should pay the price for adult decisions without question or complaint." The silence that followed Harry's speech was profound. In the crowd, Luna could see tears on the faces of parents who were perhaps realizing for the first time what their children had endured while they trusted in the wisdom of established authority. The student gathering in Diagon Alley made the front page of every wizarding publication in Britain. The Daily Prophet ran Luna's photo under the headline, "Students Speak, a New Generation Demands Accountability." The Quibbler naturally provided more detailed coverage under Xenophilius Lovegood's byline, but it was Rita Skeeter's article in Witch Weekly that captured the true significance of what had happened. What we witnessed in Diagon Alley was nothing less than a generational revolt against the assumption that children exist to serve adult purposes rather than to live their own lives. These students, Gryffindor and Slytherin, pureblood and Muggle-born, popular and outcast, have united around a principle that transcends traditional political divisions: the right to truth, safety, and informed consent. They are not demanding the destruction of Albus Dumbledore or the complete overhaul of wizarding society. They are simply insisting that power comes with accountability, that good intentions do not excuse harmful actions, and that the next generation deserves better than the necessary evils that their elders have accepted as inevitable. If the Wizengamot ignores their voices, they do so at their own peril. This is not a group of children throwing a tantrum. This is the future of Wizarding Britain declaring that they will not be sacrificed on the altar of anyone's greater good, no matter how noble that good may seem. That evening, Luna sat in her garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Hermione had gone home to spend what might be her last peaceful evening with her parents before the Wizengamot delivered its verdict. Harry had returned to Grimmauld Place, where Sirius was waiting to help him process whatever came next. Luna's father found her there, still holding the various letters of support that had arrived throughout the day. "Are you satisfied with what you've accomplished?" Xenophilius asked gently. Luna considered the question carefully. "I'm satisfied that we've spoken clearly," she said finally. "Whether anyone chooses to listen is beyond our control. And if they don't? If the Wizengamot decides that Dumbledore's methods were justified?" Luna smiled, the expression serene, despite the gravity of the situation. "Then at least the next generation will know that someone questioned those methods, that someone refused to accept that children should suffer in silence for the convenience of their elders." She looked up at her father, her silver eyes reflecting the last light of the dying day. "Sometimes, Daddy, what the most important thing you can do is plant seeds that won't bloom until after you're gone. I think we've planted quite a lot of seeds this summer." As night fell over the wizarding world, copies of the Student Declaration were being read in homes across Britain. Parents were having difficult conversations with their children about authority and accountability. Young witches and wizards were discovering that their voices could carry real weight when raised in unison. And in the Ministry of Magic, 50 members of the Wizengamot were preparing to deliver a verdict that would determine not just Albus Dumbledore's fate, but the future relationship between power and accountability in magical Britain. The students had spoken. Now it remained to be seen whether anyone in authority was brave enough to listen. To Chapter 10. Allies and Enemies. The fourth day of the hearing brought an unexpected visitor to the Wizengamot chamber, Lucius Malfoy, resplendent in robes of deepest black with silver threading that caught the torchlight like captured starfire. His presence in the gallery sent a ripple of whispers through the assembled crowd, not least because he was seated among those who had been supporting Cedric's testimony rather than in his usual position among Dumbledore's political allies. Cedric watched the elder Malfoy with fascination and no small amount of wariness. Whatever had brought the head of one of Wizarding Britain's most influential families to publicly support his case against Dumbledore, it certainly wasn't moral outrage or sympathy for endangered children. Lucius Malfoy was a creature of pure political calculation, and his presence here meant he had identified an opportunity that outweighed his traditional alliances. During the morning recess, Lucius approached Cedric with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to having his attention valued as a gift. "Mr. Diggory," he said, extending a hand encased in the finest dragonhide gloves, "I wanted to express my admiration for your courage in bringing these matters to light." Cedric accepted the handshake carefully. "Thank you, Mr. Malfoy. Though I have to admit, I'm surprised to find you among my supporters." Lucius's smile was sharp as winter wind. "I think you'll find, young man, that politics makes for strange bedfellows. I may not share your motivations, but I certainly share your conclusions about the inefficiencies in our current educational leadership." "Inefficiencies," Cedric repeated, tasting the clinical word. "Is that what we're calling child endangerment now?" "I'm calling it poor resource management," Lucius replied smoothly. Dumbledore had at his disposal one of the most powerful young wizards of his generation, and instead of properly cultivating that power, he chose to traumatize the boy repeatedly in the name of character building. It's the sort of wasteful sentimentality that has no place in effective governance. Cedric felt a chill that had nothing to do with the stone walls of the ministry. "You're supporting my testimony because you think Dumbledore should have been more efficient in his manipulation." "I'm supporting your testimony because incompetent leadership, regardless of its intentions, poses a threat to the stability of our society." Lucius's eyes glittered with cold intelligence. Dumbledore's methods may have achieved their intended result, but at what cost? A generation of traumatized children, a school environment where deadly danger is normalized, and a complete breakdown of trust between students and faculty. These are not the hallmarks of successful leadership. There was something nauseating about hearing his moral concerns translated into the language of political efficiency, but Cedric recognized the strategic value of Lucius's support. The man commanded significant influence within the Wizengamot, and his public backing would carry weight with those members who might otherwise be swayed by loyalty to Dumbledore. "And what do you hope to gain from this support?" Cedric asked directly. Lucius's smile widened. "A more competent administration at Hogwarts, naturally. One that understands the value of proper preparation and training over dramatic last-minute heroics. One that recognizes that students, especially those from established families, deserve to be educated in safety and dignity rather than used as unwitting participants in elaborate moral exercises." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Augusta Longbottom, who swept toward them with the purposeful stride of someone carrying urgent news. "Cedric," she said, barely acknowledging Lucius's presence, "we need to discuss the afternoon's testimony. Remus Lupin has agreed to appear as a witness." Cedric felt his eyebrows rise. "Professor Lupin? But isn't he a member of the Order of the Phoenix and one of Dumbledore's closest allies?" Augusta finished grimly, "which makes his testimony all the more significant." When the session resumed, Remus Lupin approached the witness stand with visible reluctance, his shabby robes a stark contrast to the formal attire worn by most who had testified. His face was drawn and pale, and Cedric could see the internal struggle playing out in the set of his shoulders. "Professor Lupin," Augusta began gently, "you have served under Professor Dumbledore's leadership in various capacities for many years. Has he ever made requests of you that you found troubling?" Lupin's hands clenched in his lap. "Yes." "Could you describe the nature of those requests?" For a long moment, Lupin remained silent, his eyes fixed on some point above the Wizengamot benches. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "After my graduation from Hogwarts, when my lycanthropy made it nearly impossible to find employment, Professor Dumbledore offered me occasional work. Small tasks, he said. Information gathering. Nothing that would compromise my conscience." Augusta nodded encouragingly. "And what did these tasks involve?" "Infiltrating werewolf packs, reporting on their activities, their plans, their allegiances." Lupin's voice grew stronger, but not happier. "I told myself it was for the greater good, that preventing werewolf attacks justified the deception of my own kind. But, Augusta prompted gently. But I began to realize that Dumbledore wasn't just gathering intelligence. He was using my reports to manipulate the werewolf community, to control their actions and allegiances. When Greyback began recruiting for Voldemort, Dumbledore had me ensure that certain potential recruits would be present at specific times and places. A murmur of confusion ran through the chamber. Augusta frowned. Professor Lupin, are you saying that Professor Dumbledore arranged for people to be turned into werewolves? Not directly, Lupin said quickly, but he positioned them where Greyback would find them, knowing what would happen. Young men and women who might have escaped the curse entirely were guided into its path, because Dumbledore needed more werewolves loyal to him rather than to Voldemort. The silence that followed was profound. Cedric felt sick to his stomach as the implications sank in. It wasn't enough that Dumbledore had manipulated Harry Potter's trials. He had been playing similar games with entire communities, sacrificing individuals to strategic necessity. Professor Lupin, Augusta continued, her voice tight with controlled anger, how many people would you estimate were affected by these arrangements? Dozens, Lupin whispered. Maybe more. All of them believing their transformation was simple bad luck, never knowing that someone had orchestrated their presence in places where lycanthropy was a likely outcome. The testimony continued with increasingly disturbing revelations. Dumbledore hadn't just manipulated Harry's individual crises, he had been conducting a decades-long campaign of social engineering, using people's trust and desperation to position them as pawns in his grand strategy against Voldemort. When Lupin finally stepped down from the witness stand, he looked decades older than when he had taken his oath. As he passed Cedric's section of the gallery, their eyes met briefly, and Cedric saw something that might have been gratitude or might have been devastation in the werewolf's expression. The evening brought news of fractures spreading far beyond the walls of the Ministry. Rita Skeeter's latest article, spread across the front page of the Evening Prophet, detailed the international response to the hearing's revelations. Dumbledore's methods questioned worldwide, screamed the headline, followed by a detailed account of magical governments across Europe expressing concern about the former Chief Warlock's conduct. The International Confederation of Wizards issued a statement today expressing deep concern about allegations regarding Albus Dumbledore's educational and administrative practices. Representatives from the French Ministry of Magic indicated that they would be reviewing Dumbledore's role in several international incidents that had previously been attributed to coincidence or enemy action. If even half of these allegations prove true, stated International Confederation Secretary-General Babajide Akingbade, then we must seriously reconsider our assumptions about events of the past 2 decades. How many international crises that we believed were caused by Death Eater activity were actually orchestrated or manipulated by someone we considered an ally? The article went on to detail similar concerns raised by magical communities in Germany, Italy, and even distant magical governments that had rarely concerned themselves with British affairs. Dumbledore's reputation as an international force for good was crumbling as rapidly as his domestic support. But it was the personal costs of the growing conflict that weighed most heavily on Cedric's mind as he made his way home that evening. He had received an urgent message from Cho, asking him to meet her at a small cafe in Diagon Alley where they could speak privately. He found her seated in a corner booth, her usually serene expression replaced by lines of worry and exhaustion. When she saw him, her relief was visible. "Cedric," she said, reaching for his hands across the small table. "I'm so glad you came. I wasn't sure, after everything that's happened." "What's wrong?" Cedric asked, though he suspected he already knew. "My parents," Cho said simply. "They received a visit from ministry officials yesterday. Nothing threatening, they insisted, just a friendly inquiry about my associations and whether I was receiving proper guidance about the complex political matters I seemed to be involving myself in." Cedric felt anger flare in his chest. "They threatened your family." Not directly, but the message was clear enough. Distance yourself from Cedric Diggory and his testimony, or find that certain opportunities for advancement become suddenly unavailable. My father works for the Department of International Magical Cooperation. They could make his life very difficult if they chose to. She looked up at him, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears. I told them I wouldn't abandon you, that what you're doing is right regardless of the personal cost. But Cedric, I'm scared. Not for myself, but for my family. They don't deserve to suffer because I chose to support the truth. Cedric squeezed her hands, drawing what comfort he could from her presence, even as the weight of responsibility settled more heavily on his shoulders. If you need to step back. I don't, Cho interrupted firmly. I won't. But I needed you to know what we're up against. It's not just Dumbledore we're challenging. It's an entire system of power that depends on people not asking uncomfortable questions. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unlikely pair, Arthur Weasley and his youngest son, Ron, both looking haggard and uncomfortable. Arthur's usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by the worn expression of a man caught between conflicting loyalties. Cedric, Cho, Arthur said quietly, settling into the booth beside them uninvited. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I needed to speak with you both. Ron remained standing, his face flushed with emotion. This is mental, he said, without preamble. Harry's my best mate, and you're asking him to believe that the one person who's always protected him is actually his enemy. You're destroying him. Cedric met Ron's angry gaze steadily. I'm asking him to face the truth about his own experiences. That's not the same thing as making Dumbledore his enemy. Isn't it? Ron shot back, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're trying to tear down the one person who's kept Harry alive all these years, and you're using a bunch of coincidences and misunderstandings to do it. Arthur placed a restraining hand on his son's arm. Ron, that's enough. Is it, Dad? Because Mum's right. This whole thing is tearing our family apart. Bill thinks you're being an idiot for supporting this. Percy's threatening to quit his job rather than be associated with your position. And Harry looks like he's dying inside every time someone mentions Dumbledore's name. Arthur's voice was quiet, but firm. Oh, and Charlie thinks I'm not going far enough in demanding accountability. Fred and George are asking why we never questioned how often Harry ended up in mortal danger. Your mother and I disagree about this, yes, but that doesn't make either of us wrong for following our conscience. He turned to Cedric, his expression grave. I came to warn you, though. The Ministry is planning to issue a statement tomorrow, distancing themselves from the hearing's implications. They're going to argue that even if Dumbledore's methods were questionable, disrupting educational stability during wartime would be dangerously irresponsible. Cho frowned. They're more afraid of change than they are of accountability. They're more afraid of admitting that they've been complicit in a system that doesn't work, Arthur corrected. If Dumbledore falls, what questions will be asked about who else knew about his methods and chose to look the other way? There are a lot of powerful people who would prefer those questions remain unasked. As Arthur and Ron left, the younger Weasley still radiating anger and confusion, Cedric found himself thinking about the web of alliances and enmities that had grown around his simple desire to tell the truth about what he had heard in a graveyard. Lucius Malfoy supported him for purely political reasons. Remus Lupin had testified against Dumbledore despite years of loyalty and gratitude. The Weasley family was fracturing along ideological lines. International governments were questioning decades of assumptions about British magical leadership. And through it all, as Harry Potter, the person all of this was supposedly meant to protect, was becoming increasingly isolated as friends and allies chose evidence over faith, accountability over loyalty. Do you think we've done the right thing? Cho asked quietly as they prepared to leave the cafe. Cedric considered the question carefully. Around them, Diagon Alley bustled with its usual evening activity, but he could sense the undercurrent of tension that had been building since the hearing began. Conversation stopped when he passed. Some people nodded respectfully, others turned away in disgust or fear. "I think," he said finally, "that we've done the necessary thing, whether it's right or not. I suppose that depends on what happens next." As they walked together through the darkening streets, Cedric reflected on how much had changed since that night in the graveyard. He had started with a simple desire for truth and justice. Now he found himself at the center of a political and moral crisis that was reshaping the entire wizarding world. Tomorrow would bring the final day of testimony. Soon, 50 members of the Wizengamot would render their verdict not just on Albus Dumbledore's conduct, but on the fundamental question of whether good intentions could justify harmful actions, whether the greater good could excuse individual suffering, and whether accountability was more important than stability. The allies he had gained were strange ones: political opportunists like Lucius Malfoy, conscience-stricken co-conspirators like Remus Lupin, and principled opponents of authority like his fellow students. Or the enemies he had made were equally unexpected: people who genuinely believed that challenging Dumbledore was more dangerous than allowing his methods to continue unchecked. But as he walked hand in hand with Cho through the evening shadows, Cedric found himself oddly at peace with the complexity of what they had unleashed. The truth was never simple, and justice was never clean, but both were worth fighting for, even when, especially when, that fight came at a personal cost. The wizarding world would be different after tomorrow, regardless of the Wizengamot's decision. And perhaps, Cedric thought, that difference was what mattered most of all. Chapter 11. The Verdict's Shadow. The final day of testimony dawned grey and humid, as if the very air was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. London's usual summer bustle seemed muted as Cedric made his way to the ministry, the weight of the past week settling on his shoulders like an invisible cloak. In a few hours, 50 of the most powerful witches and wizards in Britain would retire to deliberate on a question that had never been asked before. Could the wizarding world's greatest hero be held accountable for the methods he had used to save them all? The Wizengamot chamber was packed beyond capacity, with every seat in the public gallery filled and additional viewers standing along the walls despite official protests. The international media presence had grown throughout the week, with reporters from magical publications across Europe and beyond documenting what many were calling the trial of the century. Or Cedric found himself studying the faces in the crowd as he took his seat in the witness section. There was Cho, offering him an encouraging smile that didn't quite hide the exhaustion in her eyes. His father sat with the careful posture of a man prepared for either triumph or disaster. Luna Lovegood was present with her father, her dreamy expression more focused than usual as she watched the proceedings with evident fascination. And there, in a section reserved for what the Daily Prophet had taken to calling interested parties, sat Harry Potter. The boy who lived looked older than his 15 years, his famous lightning bolt scar stark against pale skin that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult reckonings. When their eyes met, Harry didn't look away, and Cedric saw something in his expression that might have been understanding, or might have been resignation. "The Wizengamot will hear closing arguments," Amelia Bones announced, her voice carrying easily through the silent chamber. "Senior Advocate Longbottom, you may proceed." Augusta Longbottom rose from the prosecution table with the deliberate grace of someone who had spent decades commanding courtrooms and boardrooms with equal authority. Her black robes seemed to absorb the torchlight as she moved to stand before the tiered benches of the Wizengamot. "Members of this honourable court," she began, her voice pitched to carry both strength and compassion. "Over the past week, you have heard testimony that has challenged everything we thought we knew about one of our most revered leaders. You have heard evidence of systematic endangerment, psychological manipulation, and the deliberate orchestration of trauma in service of what Professor Dumbledore has called the greater good." She paused, allowing her gaze to sweep across the assembled Wizengamot members, some of whom had served alongside Dumbledore for decades. The defense will ask you to weigh these actions against their results: the defeat of Voldemort, the survival of Harry Potter, the preservation of our world. They will argue that extreme circumstances require extreme measures, that the ends justify the means when the stakes are high enough. Augusta's voice grew harder, more cutting. But I ask you to consider what we become when we accept that children can be sacrificed for strategic advantage. What precedent do we set when we decide that good intentions excuse harmful actions? What message do we send to future generations when we declare that some people are too important to be held accountable for their choices? She gestured toward Cedric, and he felt the weight of 50 pairs of eyes settling on him like a physical presence. Mr. Diggory survived something he was never meant to survive. He heard truths he was never meant to hear. And when he chose to speak those truths aloud, he did so, knowing that it would cost him friendships, reputation, and peace of mind. He did so because he understood that silence, in the face of wrongdoing, is complicity, regardless of who the wrongdoer might be. Augusta returned to stand directly before the Wizengamot benches. You are being asked to judge not just Professor Dumbledore's actions, but the principles that govern our society. Are we a community that protects its children, or one that uses them? Are we a society that demands accountability from our leaders, or one that grants them immunity based on their past service? Are we a people who face uncomfortable truths, or one that chooses comfortable lies? Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the chamber, every word carried clearly. Professor Dumbledore may have saved our world, but who will save our children from those who claim to be saving the world? Augusta returned to her seat, and the chamber remained silent for several long moments before Kingsley Shacklebolt rose to present Dumbledore's final defense. "Members of the Wizengamot," Kingsley began, his deep voice resonating with the authority of someone who had served in both the Ministry and the Order of the Phoenix, "I will not insult your intelligence by claiming that Professor Dumbledore's methods were gentle or kind. I will not pretend that the choices he made were easy ones, or that they did not cause real pain to real people." He moved to stand where Augusta had stood, his presence commanding attention even from those who had seemed most convinced by the prosecution's case. "But I will ask you to consider the alternative. What would have happened if Professor Dumbledore had chosen the safe path, the traditional path, or the path that would have protected Harry Potter's childhood at the cost of his survival? What would have become of our world if the boy who lived had faced Voldemort unprepared, untested, and unready?" Kingsley's gaze found Harry in the gallery, and his voice grew gentler. "You have heard testimony about Harry Potter's trials and suffering, but you have also heard testimony about his courage, his moral strength, and his willingness to sacrifice himself for others. These qualities were not accidents. They were forged in the fires of adversity that Professor Dumbledore carefully constructed." The defense attorney paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the chamber. "Professor Dumbledore made a choice that no one should have to make. He decided that one child's pain was an acceptable price for the survival of our entire civilization. History will judge whether that choice was correct, but I submit that it was the only choice available to someone who understood what was truly at stake." Kingsley looked around the chamber, his eyes taking in the faces of those who would decide Dumbledore's fate. "You are being asked to punish a man for saving the world in the only way he could. I ask you to remember that sometimes the greatest acts of love require the greatest sacrifices, and sometimes protecting someone means allowing them to face dangers that would destroy lesser souls." When Kingsley returned to his seat, the chamber buzzed with quiet conversation as people processed what they had heard. But the most significant moment of the day came when Amelia Bones asked if there were any final statements from the principals themselves. Cedric rose slowly, feeling the weight of history settling around him like a mantle. This was his moment to speak directly to the 50 witches and wizards who would determine not just Dumbledore's fate, but the future of accountability in magical Britain. "Members of the Wizengamot," he began, his voice steady. "Despite the enormity of the moment, I want to be very clear about what I'm asking you to do. I'm not asking you to condemn Professor Dumbledore as a villain or to dismiss his genuine desire to protect our world. I'm asking you to recognize that good intentions do not excuse harmful actions, and that even heroes must be held accountable for their choices." He looked toward the section where Harry sat, seeing the younger boy's attention fixed on him with painful intensity. Harry Potter deserved to know the truth about what was being done to him and why. He deserved the chance to make informed choices about his own life and future. Every student at Hogwarts deserved to be protected from dangers that could have been prevented, not used as unwitting participants in elaborate moral exercises. Cedric's voice grew stronger as he continued. "Professor Dumbledore will tell you that his methods were necessary, that conventional preparation would not have been sufficient. Perhaps he's right. But that doesn't change the fact that he made these choices for other people without their knowledge or consent. That he used children as tools in his strategy against Voldemort. That he allowed suffering he could have prevented because it served his larger purpose." He took a deep breath, preparing to voice the words that would define his legacy, regardless of the verdict. "I'm not asking you to punish Professor Dumbledore out of vengeance or anger. I'm asking you to establish a principle that will protect future generations from those who would use them for the greater good. I'm asking you to declare that no one, regardless of their power, their wisdom, or their noble intentions, has the right to gamble with children's lives without accountability." When Cedric sat down, the silence that followed was profound. Then, slowly, Albus Dumbledore rose from his seat at the defendant's table and approached the center of the chamber. The headmaster looked every one of his 115 years as he stood before the Wizengamot, his usually twinkling eyes dimmed with something that might have been sorrow or might have been acceptance. "My lords and ladies," Dumbledore said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of leadership and difficult choices, "I find myself in the position of defending actions that I would not wish on my worst enemy, let alone the children I have devoted my life to protecting and educating." He paused, his gaze moving across the faces in the gallery, students he had taught, parents who had trusted him with their children, colleagues who had followed his leadership through 2 wars. "Mr. Diggory speaks eloquently about consent and knowledge, about the right of individuals to make informed choices about their own lives. In an ideal world, he would be absolutely correct. In an ideal world, I would have sat Harry Potter down on his 11th birthday and explained the prophecy that governed his destiny, the trials that awaited him, and the choices he would be forced to make." Dumbledore's voice grew sadder, but no less certain. "But we do not live in an ideal world. We live in a world where dark wizards target children, where innocence is a luxury that cannot always be afforded, and where sometimes the cruelest kindness is allowing someone to discover their own strength through adversity." He looked directly at Harry, and Cedric saw something pass between them, understanding, perhaps, or forgiveness, or simply the acknowledgement of shared suffering. "I made choices that I will regret until my dying day. That I allowed a child to face dangers that grown wizards would flee from. I withheld information that he had every right to possess. I orchestrated circumstances that caused real pain to real people, all in service of a future I hoped to secure but could never guarantee." Dumbledore's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "But I would make those choices again, because the alternative, a world ruled by Voldemort, a generation of children raised in darkness and fear, was unacceptable to me. If that makes me guilty in the eyes of this court, then I accept that guilt as the price of the choices I made." The silence that followed Dumbledore's statement stretched for what felt like hours. Finally, Amelia Bones spoke. "The Wizengamot will now retire to consider its verdict. The court is adjourned until tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock." As the formal session concluded and people began to file out of the chamber, Cedric found himself approached by someone he had been hoping to speak with, but hadn't known how to contact. "Cedric." Harry's voice was quiet, almost inaudible beneath the noise of the departing crowd. "Harry." Cedric turned to face the boy who had been at the center of everything they had discussed, debated, and dissected over the past week. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. The Hufflepuff prefect who had dared to challenge the wizarding world's greatest hero, and the boy who lived who had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the man he had trusted most. "I owe you an apology," Harry said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "When you first started asking questions, when you first suggested that maybe things weren't what they seemed, I called you a traitor. I said you were betraying someone who had saved both our lives." Cedric shook his head. "You don't owe me." "I do," Harry interrupted firmly, "because you were right, about all of it. The pattern of dangers, the orchestrated trials, the way adults kept information from me while expecting me to face consequences I didn't understand. You were right, and I was too scared to admit it." Harry's green eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I spent 4 years being grateful to Dumbledore for saving my life over and over again. It never occurred to me to ask why I needed saving so often, or why the dangers I faced were always exactly the right level of difficulty to teach me something without quite killing me." "Harry, let me finish," Harry said, his voice growing stronger. "You asked questions I should have asked. You demanded accountability I should have demanded. You spoke for me when I was too loyal or too scared to speak for myself. Whatever the Wizengamot decides tomorrow, you've given me something I never had before." "What's that?" Harry's smile was small but genuine. "The knowledge that I'm not just a weapon someone else forged, that I have the right to question the people who claim to know what's best for me, that I'm allowed to be angry about what was done to me, even if it saved the world." They stood together in the emptying chamber, two young men who had been thrust into circumstances beyond their control and had emerged changed by the experience. Around them, the ancient stones of the ministry seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what tomorrow would bring. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Harry asked quietly. Cedric considered the question, thinking about all the testimonies they had heard, all the revelations that had shaken the foundations of the wizarding world, all the relationships that had been strained or broken in the pursuit of truth. "I think," he said finally, "that we did the necessary thing, and sometimes that's the best you can hope for." As they left the ministry together, walking into the uncertain evening air, neither of them knew what verdict the Wizengamot would deliver. But they knew that whatever came next, they would face it with clear eyes and honest hearts, having learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against external enemies, but against the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about the people we trust. Or the shadow of the verdict stretched before them, dark with possibility and bright with hope. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would be ready for it, together. Chapter 12. New Foundations. The morning of August first dawned clear and bright, as if the world itself was eager to witness the conclusion of the most significant trial in wizarding history. Cedric arrived at the ministry early, finding the atrium already filled with an anxious crowd that seemed to include representatives from every corner of magical society. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a wand, as his father had remarked over a breakfast that neither of them had been able to finish. The Wizengamot chamber was packed to capacity once again, but the atmosphere was different from the previous days. Of the passionate arguments and shocking revelations had given way to a strange, expectant quiet. Everyone present understood that they were about to witness a decision that would reshape the foundations of their world. Cedric took his seat in the witness section, acutely aware of the weight of 50 pairs of eyes as the Wizengamot members filed into their tiered benches. Some looked exhausted, as if they had spent the night wrestling with impossible choices. Others appeared grimly resolved, having reached conclusions that sat heavily on their shoulders. Amelia Bones entered last, her expression carefully neutral as she assumed the Chief Warlock's position. She surveyed the chamber with the bearing of someone who understood exactly how historic this moment was. "The emergency session of the Wizengamot will come to order," she announced, or her magically amplified voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "After extensive deliberation, we have reached our verdict regarding the charges brought against Professor Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore." Dumbledore himself sat with quiet dignity at the defendant's table, his hands folded calmly in his lap. If he was nervous about what was to come, he gave no sign of it. Beside him, Kingsley Shacklebolt maintained the professional composure that had marked his defense throughout the trial, though Cedric thought he detected a slight tension in the man's shoulders. "On the charge of systematic endangerment of minors," Amelia continued, her voice ringing through the absolute silence of the chamber, "this court finds the defendant guilty." A ripple of shocked murmurs ran through the gallery. They quickly hushed as Amelia raised her hand for silence. "On the charge of abuse of educational authority," she continued, "this court finds the defendant guilty." The murmurs grew louder this time, a mix of triumph and dismay from different sections of the crowd. Cedric felt his heart pounding in his chest, scarcely able to believe what he was hearing. On the charge of psychological manipulation of minors, Amelia's voice remained steady. "This court finds the defendant guilty." But as the gallery erupted in voices, some celebrating, others protesting, Amelia was not finished. "However," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of decades of legal experience, "on the charge of malicious intent toward those in his care, this court finds the defendant not guilty. But on the charge of treason against the welfare of magical children, this court finds the defendant not guilty." The chamber fell silent again, everyone straining to understand what this mixed verdict meant. "This court acknowledges," Amelia continued, "that Professor Dumbledore's actions, while harmful and inappropriate, were motivated by genuine concern for the welfare of the wizarding world and a sincere belief that his methods were necessary to prevent a far greater catastrophe. We acknowledge his decades of service to magical Britain and his ultimate success in guiding events toward the defeat of Lord Voldemort." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the chamber. "However, this court cannot and will not accept that noble intentions excuse harmful actions, or that strategic necessity justifies the systematic endangerment of children. Professor Dumbledore, please rise for sentencing." Dumbledore stood slowly, his blue eyes meeting Amelia's gaze with what appeared to be acceptance rather than defiance. "Professor Albus Dumbledore," Amelia announced formally, "you are hereby stripped of all official positions within the Ministry of Magic, including your membership in the Wizengamot and your position as Chief Warlock. You are barred from holding any educational authority over minors for a period of 10 years. You will serve 2 years of community service under ministry supervision, working to establish new protocols for the protection of magical children." The sentence was devastating in its professional implications, but Cedric noticed what was missing. There was no mention of Azkaban, no complete destruction of the man who had led them through 2 wars against darkness. "Furthermore," Amelia continued, "this court orders the immediate implementation of new safeguards to prevent future abuses of authority in educational and governmental settings. A committee will be established to review all policies regarding the safety and welfare of magical children, with mandatory representation from student bodies and child advocacy organizations." As Amelia finished delivering the sentence, Cedric found himself experiencing a complex mixture of vindication and sorrow. He had won. The Wizengamot had acknowledged that Dumbledore's methods were wrong, that children deserved better protection, that even heroes must be held accountable for their choices. But watching the old wizard accept his punishment with quiet dignity, Cedric couldn't help feeling that everyone involved had paid a terrible price for this victory. The formal session concluded with arrangements for the community service and oversight that would govern Dumbledore's immediate future. As people began to file out of the chamber, Cedric found himself approached by Augusta Longbottom, whose usually stern expression had softened with something approaching pride. "You did it, young man," she said, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "You spoke truth to power and refused to back down when it mattered most. That takes a special kind of courage." "It doesn't feel like victory," Cedric replied honestly. "It feels like something necessary, but sad." Augusta nodded with understanding. "The best victories often do. But look around you, Cedric. Look at what you've accomplished." She gestured toward the departing crowd, where he could see students from various schools talking animatedly about the new protections that would be established, parents discussing how to better advocate for their children's safety, and even some ministry officials looking thoughtful about the changes that would need to be implemented. "You've given the next generation something precious," Augusta continued. "The knowledge that they have a voice, that they deserve protection, and that even the most powerful people in their world can be held accountable when they fail in their duty of care." Later that afternoon, Cedric found himself in a quiet corner of the ministry's public gardens, finally alone with his thoughts for the first time since the verdict had been delivered. What the past week felt like a lifetime, a transformative experience that had changed not just his own understanding of the world, but the very foundations of wizarding society. He was surprised to find Harry Potter approaching across the neatly trimmed grass, moving with the careful gait of someone who was still processing everything that had happened. "Harry," Cedric said, rising from the bench where he had been sitting. "How are you holding up?" Harry's smile was small but genuine. "Better than I expected, actually. I keep thinking I should be angrier about the verdict, that Dumbledore got off too easily, or that you got him in trouble at all. But mostly I just feel relieved. Relieved that it's over, that the truth is finally out in the open, that I don't have to carry the weight of those secrets anymore." Harry sat down beside him, his green eyes reflecting the late afternoon sunlight. "And relieved that we're talking again. I missed having you as a friend, Cedric." Cedric felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the summer weather. "I missed you too, more than I wanted to admit." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching ministry workers hurry past on their way to implement the changes that the verdict had mandated. Finally, Harry spoke again. "What happens now? For you, I mean. You've changed the wizarding world. What do you do for an encore?" Cedric considered the question carefully. Over the past week, he had received job offers from multiple organizations impressed by his courage and integrity. The Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures wanted him for their reform initiatives. Several international magical rights organizations had extended invitations for him to join their advocacy work. Even the Daily Prophet had offered him a position as an investigative journalist. "I think," Cedric said slowly, "I want to go back to school." Harry raised his eyebrows. "Back to Hogwarts?" "Eventually. But first, I want to study law properly. International magical law, child advocacy, institutional reform. All the things I had to learn on the fly during this trial." Cedric's voice grew more certain as he spoke. "What happened here can't be a one-time thing, Harry. There are probably other schools, other institutions where children are being failed by the adults who should protect them. I want to be ready for those fights." Harry nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like exactly the right thing for you to do. Though I have to ask, aren't you tired of fighting? Don't you want to just be a normal person for a while?" Cedric laughed, the sound carrying a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "I tried being normal, Harry. I was perfectly content being a prefect and Quidditch captain and model student. But then I heard something I wasn't supposed to hear, and I learned that sometimes being normal means being complicit." He looked at his friend, and Harry was his friend again, he realized with deep gratitude, with serious eyes. "I can't unknow what I know now. I can't go back to assuming that the adults in charge always have children's best interests at heart. And so I might as well use that knowledge to help other kids who might be in similar situations. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Cho Chang, who had been attending meetings with other student representatives about the new oversight committees that would be established at magical schools across Britain. "There you are," she said, settling on the grass beside their bench with the graceful ease that had first caught Cedric's attention. "I've been looking everywhere for you. The student committee wants you to consider serving as our first liaison to the new Ministry Oversight Board." Cedric felt a familiar flutter of nerves, mixed with excitement. "They want me to represent student interests to the ministry?" "They want you to do what you've been doing all along," Cho replied with a smile. "Ask uncomfortable questions. I'll demand accountability and make sure that student voices are heard when decisions are made about their welfare." As the three of them sat together in the golden afternoon light, Cedric reflected on how much had changed since that night in the graveyard. He had started with a simple desire to tell the truth about what he had witnessed. That truth had grown into something larger, a movement demanding accountability, a generation refusing to accept that their suffering was someone else's strategic necessity, a new understanding of what it meant to protect children rather than simply use them. The costs had been real. Relationships had been strained, institutions had been shaken, and a man who had genuinely tried to save the world had seen his reputation and authority stripped away. But the benefits were real too. As students would have a voice in their own governance, new protections would prevent future abuses, and perhaps most importantly, the next generation would grow up knowing that they deserved truth, safety, and respect from the adults who held power over their lives. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Cho asked quietly, echoing the question that had been haunting all of them since the verdict. Cedric considered this one final time, thinking of all the testimony they had heard, all the lives that had been touched by Dumbledore's methods, all the children who might be better protected because of what had happened in that courtroom. "I think," he said finally, "that we did the necessary thing. And sometimes that's the best you can hope for." As the sun set over London, casting long shadows across the ministry gardens, or three young people sat together, planning a future that would be built on different foundations than the past. They had learned that heroes could be flawed, that good intentions didn't excuse harmful actions, and that sometimes the most important thing you could do was ask uncomfortable questions that everyone else wanted to ignore. The wizarding world would be different because of what had happened over the past week. Not perfect, perhaps not even better in all ways, but different. And in that difference lay the hope that future generations would inherit a society that valued their voices, protected their welfare, and held its leaders accountable for their choices. Cedric Diggory had survived something he was never meant to survive, had heard truths he was never meant to hear, and had spoken words that had changed the world. But now he was ready to help build the new foundations that would rise from the ruins of comfortable assumptions and unquestioned authority. It was, he thought, exactly the kind of future worth fighting for. Now what if Petunia Dursley left? Harry on the Weasleys' doorstep, at age 3, and Molly raised him as her 8th child. What if the Sorting Hat refused to sort Harry until Dumbledore answered for what he had done to the boy? What if Hermione used a time-turner to go back to the night? Harry's parents died, and found Dumbledore, already there. Watching What If, Minerva McGonagall quit Hogwarts. At age 60, and raised Harry in a cottage in Scotland, far from Dumbledore's control. What if Sirius Black and Fleur Delacour arrived at the Dursleys on the same night, both determined to take Harry and never bring him back? What if Cedric Diggory survived the graveyard and testified that Dumbledore knew the tournament was a trap? What if Bill Weasley broke every ward Dumbledore had placed on Privet Drive and found dark magic that should never have been nearer. To child What If, Hermione found a locked room in Hogwarts that contained every child Dumbledore had sacrificed before. Harry What If, Severus Snape took Harry. The night Lily died and raised him in Spinner's End without telling a soul. What if Victor Krum offered Harry asylum in Bulgaria after the Triwizard Tournament, and Hermione helped him escape? What if Harry walked out of Hogwarts in front of the entire school at age 12, and Snape was the one who held the door open? What if Pansy Parkinson overheard Dumbledore's plan in the dungeons and warned Harry before it was too late? What if Lily Potter left a second letter hidden in Gringotts, and it named every person Dumbledore told her to trust? What if Amelia Bones launched a full investigation into Dumbledore after Harry's name came out of the Goblet of Fire? What if the Hogwarts portraits came alive during Harry's trial, and every former headmaster testified against Dumbledore? What if Neville Longbottom's grandmother Augusta demanded Harry be placed with her after she learned what the Dursleys had done? What if Draco Malfoy switched sides at age 13 after watching Dumbledore send Harry into the Chamber of Secrets alone? What if Arthur Weasley found Dumbledore's name on a ministry surveillance order for Harry filed the day after Lily and James died? What if the Goblin Nation declared Harry a protected ward of Gringotts and told Dumbledore he had no authority over the Potter vaults? What if Kingsley Shacklebolt found Harry during a routine aura check on Privet Drive and reported the Dursleys to the Ministry? What if Remus Lupin found Lily's diary in the ruins of Godric's Hollow, and every entry was about Dumbledore's demands? What if Madame Pomfrey documented every injury? Harry arrived with each September and handed the file to the Wizengamot. What if Blaise Zabini and Hermione Granger formed a secret alliance in third year to get Harry out of Dumbledore's grip? What if Neville Longbottom was the boy who lived instead, and Harry grew up free until Dumbledore came looking for him at age 14? What if every Hogwarts student in Harry's year signed a petition against Dumbledore and Luna Lovegood delivered it to the Daily Prophet? What if Fleur Delacour brought the French ministry's auras to Hogwarts after the third task and demanded Harry be released into her custody? What if Dobby smuggled Harry out of Privet Drive at age 6 and hid him in the Room of Requirement for 5 years before Hogwarts? What if Winky the house elf testified at the Wizengamot that Barty Crouch, Sr., knew about Dumbledore's plan for Harry all along?